What if the most dangerous knowledge in the ancient world wasn't about kings or gods, but women? Behind temple walls once lived forbidden systems of female-only power, coded rites, moontime calendars, blood price initiations, secrets so fiercely guarded that men who learned them didn't get punished. They vanished. The women's customs we hear today are the sanitized versions preserved by male scribes. The real practices were buried because they gave women something ancient authorities feared: independent spiritual authority and knowledge that bypassed men entirely. Welcome to 25 Forbidden Ancient Women's Mysteries That Men Were Killed for Knowing. If hidden history pulls you in, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now, we begin. The torches flicker against the cavernous stone walls of Eleusis, painting wavering shadows over barley water bowls, ritual staffs, and the long robes of the officiating women. A hush falls over the hall, an atmosphere thick with wheat dust, incense, and expectation. In this space, for nearly 2 millennia, initiates swore an oath so deadly that even speaking about speaking it was a crime. The penalty for violation wasn't social ostracism or religious censure. It was death by the state's own hand, executed with the same legal precision used for treason against the Athenian democracy itself. The official narrative presents a harmless agricultural rite celebrating the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. A mystery of Demeter and Persephone, wrapped in poetic metaphor about grain returning to the earth each winter. Modern scholarship has expanded this view, suggesting the mysteries involved ergot-laced barley drinks that induced visions of agricultural renewal, or dramatic reenactments of mythological stories that provided psychological comfort about mortality. This interpretation satisfies our contemporary preference for viewing ancient religion as either primitive superstition evolving toward philosophy, or mystical experience safely contained within symbolic frameworks that pose no real threat to established power structures. The documented truth reveals something far more concrete and politically threatening than comfortable academic theories suggest. The Eleusinian Mysteries enforced secrecy with systematic force of law, backed by Athens' military and judicial apparatus functioning at maximum efficiency. Not only initiates, but men in particular, faced lethal punishment if they witnessed or disclosed the women-only components of the rites. Plutarch writes of Themistocles executing men who attempted to imitate the rites in public, noting that the general treated this as a matter of state security rather than religious propriety. Cicero refers to the most sacred penalties for transgression, noting that Athens would pursue violators across international boundaries, demanding extradition from allied cities, and treating disclosure as an act of war against the Athenian state itself. Inscriptions found at Eleusis spell it out with legal precision: disclosure equals death, without exception or appeal. But these inscriptions also reveal something more specific and threatening to male authority. The penalties were explicitly gendered in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about social order. Men who attempted to observe women-only ritual components faced immediate execution without trial. Men who learned feminine ritual techniques faced execution even if they never used them. Women who disclosed these same secrets to men also faced execution, but women who shared them with other women faced only fines or temporary exclusion from future rites. The law itself encoded the principle that certain knowledge was inherently gendered and that crossing these boundaries constituted a capital offense against both divine and human order. Why such devastating severity for what appeared to be a harvest festival? Archaeological evidence reveals that the core rituals were gendered in ways that fundamentally threatened existing power structures. Women held exclusive control over parts of the initiation sequence considered foundational: preparation of the kaikion drink, whose recipe involved secret fermentation techniques passed down through generations, handling of sacred objects never described in surviving texts, ritual laments whose words were never transcribed by male scribes, and purification ceremonies whose techniques were never explained in public religious discourse. Even high-ranking males could participate only after women completed these foundational steps that remained forever mysterious to male participants. The human texture emerges from fragmentary sources. Women wore long, saffron-dyed peplos garments whose specific weave and coloring marked their ritual status and level of initiation. They carried woven baskets hiding sacred objects, things shown, things said, things performed, that constituted the core mystery. Their chants echoed through the night, sounds described as hauntingly beautiful, but never transcribed, never translated into the public religious vocabulary that men controlled. When men tried to steal this knowledge, like the infamous Alcibiades accused of parodying the rites at a private dinner party, the state reacted with swift violence, exile, or execution that demonstrated the political importance of these restrictions. The charges against Alcibiades weren't religious sacrilege in our modern sense, but political treason, treated with the same legal seriousness as betraying military secrets to enemy states. The mysteries weren't just about religion. They were about who controlled access to the divine, who mediated between human and cosmic order, who held the keys to spiritual legitimacy that underpinned political authority. In a society where political legitimacy depended ultimately on divine approval mediated through ritual performance, women's control over the most important religious experience constituted a form of political power that threatened the entire structure of male dominance. Eleusis reveals the blueprint that would repeat across cultures. Women's ritual knowledge posed such a fundamental threat to male-dominated institutions that it required systematic suppression backed by state violence applied without mercy. Imagine a hillside in late autumn, the air cold enough to sting exposed skin and sharp with the smell of burning wood mixed with decomposing flesh. Smoke rises from carefully constructed fires fed by dried branches and pig remains, creating a haze that obscures the movements of thousands of women gathered in circles that stretch across the landscape like some vast military encampment. The sounds carry for miles, rhythmic calls that rise and fall like breathing, responses echoing across valleys in patterns that suggest complex musical structures, laughter that turns sharp and ritualized before dissolving into chants in dialects that male linguists never recorded. Then silence so complete it suggests something sacred and dangerous occurring in the darkness, something requiring absolute concentration and unified purpose. The official narrative, preserved in male-authored texts and amplified by modern scholarship that treats women's religion as essentially domestic, presents a cheerful gathering where married women celebrate Demeter and Persephone, sharing domestic concerns and ensuring agricultural fertility for the coming year. According to this interpretation, the Thesmophoria was a festival of female bonding, perhaps involving fertility symbols and ritual purification, but ultimately serving to reinforce traditional gender roles by celebrating women's connection to natural cycles of reproduction and agricultural abundance. Aristophanes turned it into a comedy, the kind of thing men joked about because they couldn't attend, but assumed it was harmless household religion scaled up to festival size. Modern interpretations have faithfully followed this pattern, treating the Thesmophoria as women's religious gathering that probably involved fertility symbols, certainly included social bonding and information exchange, but ultimately posed no threat to broader social order. Archaeological evidence seems to support this benign interpretation. Festival sites located near agricultural areas, remains of food preparation and consumption, votive offerings related to fertility and prosperity, evidence suggesting community support rather than subversive activity. This comfortable academic consensus ignores the systematic violence that protected these gatherings from male intrusion. The documented truth reveals something far deadlier and more politically significant than academic comfort zones allow. The Thesmophoria was serious enough that ancient legal fragments, scholia, and lexicons record with bureaucratic precision that men who intruded were beaten, mutilated, or killed, not symbolically or occasionally, but systematically and legally. The rituals involved decomposed pig remains whose manipulation required specialized knowledge of decay processes, offerings to chthonic forces whose invocation was believed to affect underworld powers controlling agricultural fertility, and secret exchange of jokes, chants, and codes that male scribes refused to record, but whose content was considered politically sensitive enough to warrant death penalties for disclosure. Women conducted purification rites involving blood manipulation and symbolic washing, believed to affect not just personal purity, but community-wide spiritual status. They performed lamentations that summoned underworld powers believed to control the agricultural cycle on which Greek city-states depended economically. Most significantly, They conducted an unrecorded ceremony involving the anodos, the rising up of decayed offerings retrieved from underground pits whose contents had been fermenting for months in processes requiring sophisticated understanding of decomposition chemistry. Ancient sources suggest this ceremony involved manipulation of decomposed organic matter whose symbolic and practical properties were never explained in male-authored texts. Hesychius writes plainly, "Men who entered the Thesmophorion were put to death." Other sources provide specific details about these penalties. Men caught observing the rites faced exposure, being tied to posts and left to die while their suffering served as public warning. Men attempting to learn the ritual techniques faced stoning by the participating women themselves, who were legally authorized to serve as judges and executioners. Men caught teaching the rites to other men faced being thrown from cliffs or ritual mutilation that left violators alive but permanently marked as boundary crossers. The violence wasn't random religious hysteria, it was systematic, legal, and supported by civic authority that treated violations as threats to state security. City-states across Greece enforced these penalties because the thesmophoria wasn't about fertility in any simple agricultural sense. It was about women controlling ritual technologies that affected agricultural success through spiritual manipulation, political legitimacy through control of community purity, and cosmic order through communication with underworld powers. In societies where agricultural failure meant starvation and political instability, women who controlled the spiritual technologies ensuring agricultural success held ultimate economic and political power that superseded traditional male authority. The pattern becomes clear. Women controlled ritual technologies that men couldn't access. Men feared the consequences of even knowing what happened inside these sacred spaces. Violence protected knowledge that threatened existing power structures through spiritual means that bypassed traditional political channels. Lanterns cast dancing shadows against alabaster walls, carved with hieroglyphic warnings, whose translation reveals the systematic nature of gender-based ritual restrictions in ancient Egyptian temple complexes. Priestesses in white linen, their hair scented with kaifi, and their hands painted with henna in intricate patterns marking ritual rank and specialization, move in slow geometric precision around an inner sanctuary whose very architecture enforces secrecy through massive stone construction. This chamber is sealed, not metaphorically, but physically, with stone blocks requiring multiple women to move and whose displacement leaves clear evidence of unauthorized entry. Reliefs carved into the walls describe with legal precision who may enter this space, what qualifications they must possess, and what penalties await those who violate these restrictions. The official narrative presents Isis worship as remarkably inclusive, open to all genders and social classes, eventually spreading across the Mediterranean as a religion of salvation that transcended traditional cultural boundaries. Plutarch describes Isis festivals where men and women participated together in public processions and offerings. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Roman Empire supports this interpretation for public cult activities. Mixed-gender festivals, temple complexes accessible to diverse populations, artwork showing people of various backgrounds participating in Isis worship, and inscriptional evidence of male and female priests working together in temple administration and public religious ceremonies. Modern scholarship has emphasized Isis as a goddess who broke down traditional barriers, welcoming slaves and free men and women, Egyptians and foreigners into a universal religious community. This interpretation fits contemporary preferences for ancient religions that appear progressive and inclusive, prefiguring modern values of equality and universal access to spiritual experience. However, Egyptian temple protocols reveal a more complex reality when hieroglyphic inscriptions are examined in detail. Administrative texts differentiate sharply between publicly accessible cult rituals and gender-restricted rites, whose access was controlled with the same legal precision used for state security. Several temple decrees reference lethal penalties for unauthorized entry, especially male entry into chambers associated with feminine purity rites and mourning liturgies. One text from Philae warns with bureaucratic precision, "Let no man intrude upon the chamber of the women. Death shall be his payment to the goddess, and his body shall feed the sacred crocodiles. Other inscriptions describe specific procedures for dealing with violators: interrogation to determine the extent of their knowledge, ritual purification to remove spiritual contamination from the sacred space, execution by drowning or exposure, and disposal of remains in ways that prevented spiritual contamination while serving as warnings. Priestesses were keepers of specific mourning chants tied to the myth of Isis, searching for Osiris. Lamentations believed to possess the concrete power to wake the dead and guide souls through afterlife trials described in funerary texts like the Book of the Dead. These techniques involve precise breath control, learned through years of systematic training, specific incense combinations whose formulas were guarded as trade secrets, and ritual manipulations of mummy wrappings and funerary objects whose symbolic and practical properties were never fully explained in texts accessible to male priests. Some chants were believed to reverse death temporarily, allowing communications between living and deceased that affected inheritance disputes, political succession, and commercial obligations. These weren't metaphorical powers, they were concrete ritual technologies whose effectiveness was measured by observable outcomes that could be verified and tested. Temple records describe specific cases of men who attempted to learn these techniques. Merchants sought to contact deceased business partners to resolve commercial disputes threatening their survival. Politicians hoped to legitimize their rule through communication with dead pharaohs, whose approval would validate their claims to divine authority. Foreign diplomats attempted to learn Egyptian death communication techniques for intelligence advantages. Even priests from other Egyptian cults attempted to expand their ritual repertoires. In every recorded case, regardless of social status or political connections, the penalty was immediate execution without trial, usually by drowning in waters believed to carry contamination away from temple grounds. The human detail emerges from archaeological evidence. Ritual women anointed themselves with perfumed resin mixed according to secret formulas, wore faience bracelets shaped like protective serpents, carried ivory clappers used only in night laments, and followed choreographic patterns requiring years of training to master. Their white linen garments were woven with threads treated in sacred pools, and their henna patterns followed geometric designs corresponding to star charts and underworld maps. Pattern expansion becomes unmistakable. Female ritual secrecy wasn't superstition. It was institutionalized law, encoded with the same precision used for taxation and property rights. Women's ritual monopoly was a legal institution backed by state power and enforced through systematic violence that operated as efficiently as any other government function. The sound is unforgettable, the rising, trembling cry of lamentation that Mesopotamian women performed for the dead, a vocal technique so distinctive that it could be heard for miles across the flat river plains of Sumer and Akkad. Not random wailing or emotional expression, but precisely controlled vocal techniques passed down through generations of specialists whose training was as rigorous as any craft guild. The Galu Lament, the Balag, the Ershema. Dirges believed to open a door between worlds, to guide souls through underworld trials described in texts like The Descent of Inanna, and to influence the gods who determined the deceased's fate. These women weren't mere singers or mourners. They were ritual technicians whose expertise was measured by concrete outcomes. The official narrative treats them as professional mourners, women hired to cry at funerals, to add emotional weight to burial ceremonies, to provide services that families could purchase like any other funeral arrangement. This interpretation fits comfortably with ancient and modern assumptions about women's religious roles: emotional, expressive, supportive of male-dominated institutions, but ultimately peripheral to serious religious or political functions. Administrative cuneiform tablets, however, reveal something far more dangerous when their legal language is analyzed carefully. The Eresh.Dingir, the Holy Women of Lamentation, possessed ritual techniques including specialized breath control, specific rhythmic keening, and coordinated use of ritual blades, bells, and incense burners in combinations believed to affect the spiritual status of the dead in measurable ways. These techniques weren't entertainment or emotional expression. They were spiritual operations whose effectiveness was judged by observable outcomes. Could the practitioner successfully guide the deceased through underworld trials whose navigation was indicated by specific signs? Could she facilitate communication between living family members and deceased relatives whose messages could be verified? Could she influence divine judgment in ways affecting inheritance disputes, business partnerships, and political successions that depended on the deceased's continued approval? More importantly, these techniques were legally restricted through criminal law rather than religious tradition. A Sumerian administrative text records, "No man shall learn the laments of the holy women. He who learns them shall be cut down by the sword." The penalty wasn't religious excommunication, it was immediate execution by state authority. Another Akkadian legal fragment references the death of the man who hears the lament as a woman does, suggesting that even overhearing these rituals in their complete form, understanding their full technical content rather than simply hearing external sound, constituted a capital offense. Why such systematic severity for funeral songs? Because these lamentations weren't about grief, they were spiritual operations determining afterlife outcomes, political legitimacy, and cosmic order. In societies where royal authority depended on divine approval, mediated through ancestral spirits, where commercial partnerships required the continued blessing of deceased founders, where legal disputes were resolved through communication with dead witnesses, women who controlled these communication technologies held ultimate political and economic power. Control of death communication meant control of political succession, since new rulers required approval from deceased predecessors whose spirits could legitimate or delegitimate political claims. It meant control of economic inheritance, since business partnerships often required ongoing communication with deceased parties. It meant control of legal procedure, since many disputes were resolved through testimony from deceased witnesses. The human detail survives in archaeological remains. Women smeared ashes on their cheeks in patterns corresponding to underworld maps, tied reed cords around their wrists marking ritual rank, sat in circles mimicking womb shapes, symbolic rebirth for the deceased, but also practical formations that amplified vocal techniques through acoustic principles requiring technical understanding. Legal archives describe specific cases of men who attempted to learn these techniques and the systematic response their attempts provoked. Kings seeking to contact deceased predecessors without female mediation faced execution despite political authority. Merchants hoping to secure favorable judgment for deceased partners faced immediate death despite economic importance. Foreign diplomats attempting to understand Mesopotamian death communication for intelligence purposes faced execution despite diplomatic immunity. Even male priests from other cults attempting to expand ritual authority faced death despite religious status. In every documented case, the penalty was immediate execution without trial or appeal. By the time this legal framework reached the Hittite kingdoms, it had evolved into something even more systematic, secrecy weaponized into an instrument of state power. Night hangs heavy over a Hittite courtyard, the air thick with incense smoke, and the metallic smell of fresh blood mixed with burning herbs. The atmosphere crackles with legal tension, suggesting judicial proceedings rather than religious ceremony. Bowls of animal blood sit on low stone tables, carved with cuneiform instructions for their use, each vessel marked with symbols indicating the specific type of judgment being sought and the divine authority being invoked. Women in crimson-dyed wool, ritual specialists whose training began in childhood and whose expertise was tested through practical examinations as rigorous as any legal certification, move between the tables with practiced precision, chanting to the gods who govern purity, oath-taking, and the fates of the accused. This isn't religious ceremony in any modern sense. This is a legal proceeding where women serve as judges, jury, and executioner. The official narrative presents Hittite religion as dominated by male priests with occasional female assistants, performing specialized but subordinate functions. Royal inscriptions describe kings performing rituals to storm gods and sun deities, receiving divine approval for military campaigns and political decisions. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation for public state ceremonies. Temples dedicated to male deities, relief sculptures showing kings in priestly roles, administrative texts describing male priestly hierarchies, managing temple property, and conducting official religious business that supported state functions. Diplomatic archives describe Hittite religion in terms neighboring kingdoms could understand: systematic theology, organized priesthood, state-sponsored ceremonies that legitimated political authority through divine approval. The CTH corpus, Hittite ritual tablets discovered at Boğazköy and other archive sites, reveals hidden layers of female ritual authority that operated parallel to and often superseded official male religious institutions. These tablets describe female-only purification and blood witness rites, whose primary purpose was determining guilt, legitimacy, and divine favor in legal disputes that official courts couldn't resolve through conventional evidence and testimony. These rituals involved sophisticated blood manipulation techniques, whose mastery required years of training in animal physiology, chemistry, and symbolic systems connecting earthly procedures to cosmic justice. Practitioners learned to identify specific properties of blood from different animals: sheep blood for innocence testing, bull blood for authority verification, bird blood for communication with sky deities governing truth and justice. Crucially, multiple tablets specify that men who view or violate these rites are to be executed immediately without trial or appeal. One fragmentary text states, "If a man sees the women at the ritual of blood purification, they shall burn him alive in the courtyard before the sun sets." Another describes boundary lines marked with consecrated stones that men could not cross under penalty of death, even if summoned as witnesses by legal authorities or commanded by direct royal order. Even the king himself was explicitly forbidden to observe these proceedings, despite his theoretical authority over all legal matters and his divine status as the storm god's representative. Why such extreme measures for what modern scholars often dismiss as purification rituals? Legal archives provide the answer. These rites controlled purity categories that determined guilt, legitimacy, and divine favor in ways affecting inheritance disputes, political succession, international treaties, and military alliances. Women who conducted blood witness procedures were arbiters of spiritual status, whose verdicts carried the force of divine law, superseding human authority. Their decisions affected the most important legal and political questions in Hittite society, and their rulings were recognized and enforced by neighboring kingdoms through international treaty obligations that required cross-border cooperation in tracking and punishing violators. Legal archives document specific cases where men attempted to circumvent these proceedings. Accused criminals seeking to avoid judgment through traditional courts faced execution when they attempted to observe or interfere with female blood witness procedures. Rival political claimants hoping to discredit legitimately appointed successors faced immediate death when they tried to manipulate or undermine female purification verdicts. Foreign diplomats attempting to understand Hittite judicial procedures for intelligence purposes faced execution despite diplomatic status and international legal protection. The human detail emerges from archaeological remains. Ritual women wore red belts knotted 3 times symbolizing blood, birth, and oath, chanted repetitive syllables interpreted as imitating heartbeat patterns, and used copper vessels showing wear patterns consistent with precise measurement and mixing of liquid substances. With these 5 cases, spanning multiple cultures and several centuries, the pattern becomes unmistakable and systematic. Across diverse political systems and religious traditions, women held ritual knowledge so threatening to existing power structures that states developed sophisticated legal frameworks designed to control access through systematic violence. This wasn't random superstition, cultural accident, or primitive gender conflict. It was conscious institutional policy designed to control access to spiritual technologies that determine political legitimacy, legal authority, and cosmic order itself. The more sophisticated the civilization, the more systematic and legally precise the suppression became, suggesting that the threat these women posed was both real and clearly recognized by contemporary political authorities who understood exactly what they were fighting against. The pattern would only deepen as legal systems evolved to protect the foundations of male political authority from spiritual challenges that bypassed traditional power structures entirely. Moonlight slices across the limestone courtyards of Carthage, casting sharp geometric shadows between the towering columns of Tanit's temple. The night is still, uncannily so. Even the Mediterranean, usually restless against the Punic harbors where Carthaginian warships rock at anchor, seems to hold its breath in reverence. In the sacred precinct of Tanit, a procession of priestesses moves barefoot across cool stone, worn smooth by centuries of ritual passage. Their skin is dusted with white clay imported from the Atlas Mountains, their intricately braided hair threaded with silver wire that glints like captured starlight under the moon's pale gaze. The official narrative surrounding Carthaginian religion has been shaped by Roman propaganda and later archaeological interpretations that minimize women's roles. We are told that Carthaginian religious life revolved around the notorious child sacrifices of the Tophet, agricultural fertility rites, and civic ceremonies conducted by male priests serving the state pantheon. Women, according to this sanitized version, were decorative participants at best, peripheral figures who assisted in domestic rituals while men handled the serious business of communicating with the gods. This narrative conveniently ignores the mounting archaeological evidence that paints an entirely different picture. Punic inscriptions recovered from multiple sites across North Africa, particularly the carefully preserved steles from the Tophet of Carthage itself, reveal a sophisticated network of women-only lunar rites dedicated to Tanit, the supreme female deity of the Carthaginian pantheon. These weren't minor domestic ceremonies, but major religious observances that operated under strict gender segregation. The inscriptions describe cryptic chants passed down through maternal lineages, secret offerings known only to initiated women, and ritual actions explicitly barred to men under penalty of severe divine and earthly retribution. The warnings carved into these ancient stones are unambiguous in their severity. One particularly well-preserved stele, discovered in 1924, warns against those who profane the women's mysteries, while another threatens that violators will drink the bitter cup of Tanit's wrath. The punishments described across multiple inscriptions are chillingly ambiguous yet unmistakably final. Let him be removed from the living. Let no record of him remain. Let him be given to the goddess. Modern archaeologists continue to debate whether these were euphemisms for execution, ritual exile, or something more mysterious, complete erasure from Carthaginian society. The severity of these prohibitions becomes understandable when we recognize that Tanit wasn't merely a fertility goddess in the domesticated modern sense. She was understood as a cosmic enforcer, the divine power behind Carthage's remarkable protection and prosperity in a hostile Mediterranean world. Her lunar cycle rituals, conducted exclusively by women during the 3 nights surrounding each new moon, were believed to influence everything from agricultural yields and trade winds to political stability and military success. The Carthaginians, pragmatic as they were mystical, understood that their empire's survival depended on maintaining proper relationships with the forces that governed natural and human affairs. The secrecy surrounding these rites mattered precisely because the rituals were believed to be inherently dangerous, not for the women performing them, who had been prepared through years of initiation, but for uninitiated men who might witness them. Male intrusion risked cosmic imbalance that could manifest as anything from crop failures to military defeats. In a civilization that had fought 3 wars with Rome and understood how precarious prosperity could be, such risks were unacceptable. Contemporary chroniclers, both Carthaginian and foreign, provide tantalizing glimpses of these ceremonies. The priestesses painted their faces and exposed skin with kaolin white earth mixed with powdered pearls, creating an otherworldly luminescence that enhanced their resemblance to Tanit herself. Often depicted as a pale lunar figure, their silver-threaded braids weren't merely decorative, they were designed to catch and reflect moonlight, creating a visual manifestation of the goddess's presence during the rituals. The women carried shallow bronze bowls filled with imported olive oil and crushed myrtle leaves, lighting these sacred flames at the exact moment when the moon reached its apex above the temple's central spire. The astronomical precision required for these ceremonies suggests that Carthaginian priestesses possessed sophisticated knowledge of lunar cycles and celestial mechanics. Recent analysis of Punic calendars indicates that the timing of major political and military decisions often coincided with the completion of these lunar rites, suggesting that the priestess's observations influence state policy through channels that remain historically obscure. What makes the Carthaginian evidence particularly significant is how it demonstrates that women's exclusive religious authority wasn't limited to Greek or Near Eastern contexts. This pattern of female ritual dominance extended across the Mediterranean and into North Africa, suggesting a widespread ancient understanding that certain forms of divine communication required specifically feminine intermediaries. The Carthaginian priestesses represent one of the most politically influential examples of this phenomenon, wielding religious authority that directly impacted the governance of one of antiquity's most powerful civilizations. Just south of Carthage, among the Berber tribes of the Atlas Mountains, this tradition of women's secret ritual knowledge took an even more dramatic form, one that transformed religious authority into military strategy and changed the course of North African history. A desert night wind sweeps red dust across the massive fortress walls of Meroe, the capital that commanded trade routes stretching from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. The wind carries with it the metallic scent of the Nile and the distant thunder of the great cataracts that marked Kush's natural boundaries. Inside the royal compound, war drums echo rhythmically under a black sky streaked with brilliant stars that ancient Kushite astronomers read like celestial battle maps. A circle of priestesses, their dark skin gleaming with ritual oils, surrounds the Kandake, the reigning queen whose military prowess and political acumen were feared from the marble halls of Rome to the bustling trading ports of the Horn of Africa. She stands motionless in lacquered gold armor that captures and reflects the flickering torchlight, her muscled arms outstretched as experienced women trace intricate ochre symbols across her skin with the precision of master craftsmen. The official narrative surrounding the Kandakes has been deliberately sanitized by both ancient Roman propaganda and modern archaeological interpretation. The Kandaks were fierce warrior queens with ceremonial roles. This neat, dismissive summary reduces these formidable rulers to exotic curiosities rather than acknowledging them as the sophisticated political and military strategists they demonstrably were. Such superficial characterization serves to obscure the complex ritual systems that underpin their remarkable military successes against some of antiquity's most powerful empires, including multiple victories against Roman legions that forced Rome to negotiate rather than conquer. The documented truth, preserved in Nubian inscriptions carved in the elegant Meroitic script and corroborated by grudging Greco-Roman sources, reveals something far more strategically sophisticated than mere ceremonial pageantry. Before major military campaigns, each Kandake underwent intensive women-only war rites that represented a carefully orchestrated fusion of ancestral invocation, controlled ritual intoxication, systematic divination techniques, and elaborate symbolic body painting designed to confer both supernatural protection and tangible military advantages through enhanced psychological preparation and strategic insight. The Meroitic stelae discovered throughout Sudan consistently reference the guarded circle, a sacred formation of initiated priestesses that surrounded the queen during these critical pre-battle preparations. This protective barrier wasn't merely symbolic. It functioned as an impenetrable security perimeter that no man could breach under penalty of immediate execution. Linguistic analysis of these ancient texts reveals that violation of this sacred boundary was considered simultaneously an act of sacrilege against the gods and treason against the Kushite state, carrying the full weight of both divine and earthly justice. Historical documentation confirms that this prohibition was enforced with lethal consistency. The execution of male spies who attempted to witness or decode these rituals is extensively documented across multiple independent sources. Herodotus's detailed commentary on Kushite women's war secrets, numerous Meroitic funerary inscriptions commemorating fallen warriors and executed infiltrators, and classical Roman military accounts that describe foreign agents being systematically taken and removed from the world for attempting to penetrate these ceremonies. One particularly revealing Roman chronicler wrote with obvious military frustration that Kushite women possessed the supernatural ability to sing the queen into victory, a phenomenon that modern historians and anthropologists interpret as sophisticated ritual trance induction. a psychological and political weapon for which Roman military doctrine had developed no effective countermeasures. The human details of these ceremonies reveal their profound psychological and strategic sophistication. Before each major military campaign, teams of experienced priestesses meticulously daubed the candidate's arms, shoulders, and torso with precise ochre patterns that symbolized the life-giving rivers of Nubia, the protective presence of royal ancestors stretching back generations, and the unbroken divine lineage connecting her directly to the goddess Isis and other Nubian deities. They burned carefully prepared combinations of imported frankincense, myrrh, and local resins gathered from acacia trees, creating aromatic smoke so dense that it filled the fortress chambers with an otherworldly fog that induced altered states of consciousness designed to enhance both spiritual receptivity and strategic clarity. Their ritual chants incorporated rhythmically complex vocal patterns that seemed designed to bypass conscious analytical thought and speak directly to primal centers of courage, determination, and tactical intuition. These powerful vocalizations featured dissonant harmonies that created an almost hypnotic effect, filled with repeated invocations of lioness deities, Sekhmet the Destroyer, Tefnut the Fierce, and local Nubian goddesses whose sacred names have been lost to time, but whose protective presence was believed to flow directly into the queen's consciousness during these transformative rituals. The punishment for male intrusion into these sacred spaces was swift, absolute, and often deliberately public, death carried out before assembled witnesses to reinforce the inviolable boundaries surrounding women's ritual knowledge. Kushite legal codes, preserved in both Meroitic inscriptions and later Greek translations, explicitly categorized the war rites not merely as religious practices, but as matters of critical national security requiring the highest levels of protection. The reasoning behind such extreme security measures was devastatingly practical. If enemy men successfully learned the specific techniques, timing, invocations, and psychological methods employed in these ceremonies, they could potentially develop countermeasures or attempt to replicate them for their own rulers. If foreign spies captured and transmitted this knowledge to Rome or other hostile powers, the unique military advantages that had kept Kush independent for over a millennium would be compromised, and the kingdom would inevitably fall to better-equipped invaders. The Kushite example introduces a crucial dimension. Female-only rites functioned as sophisticated military intelligence operations, where spiritual authority and state security merged into a single, impenetrable defense system. Oak leaves tremble under an early morning breeze in the ancient sanctuary of Dodona, their rustling creating a symphony that has echoed across this sacred grove for over 2 millennia. Bronze cauldrons, suspended from iron chains blackened by centuries of weather, chime softly as the metal contracts in the cool dawn air. These ethereal sounds drift across the hallowed precinct, believed by countless pilgrims to be the direct voice of Zeus speaking through his sacred oak. But the most crucial divine communication occurring at Dodona isn't the prophetic utterances that men were permitted to hear during public consultations. It's the sacred whispers that they were absolutely forbidden from witnessing on pain of exile or death. The official narrative surrounding Dodona presents it as an egalitarian religious institution where anyone, regardless of gender, social status, or origin, could approach the oracle, pose their questions to the gods, and receive authoritative divine interpretation through the priestesses who served as intermediaries. This sanitized version emphasizes the democratic accessibility of divine wisdom and the oracle's role as a neutral arbiter of fate for all who sought guidance. Modern classical scholars have largely accepted this interpretation, portraying Dodona as a beacon of ancient Greek religious inclusivity. However, the documented historical truth reveals that this public-facing oracle represented only the visible surface of a far more complex and stratified religious system. The real spiritual work occurred in hidden chambers and secluded groves where men were absolutely prohibited from entering. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE with access to oral traditions now lost to us, explicitly mentions exclusive women's rights that predated the male priesthood's institutional involvement by centuries. Hesiod's fragmentary references to the women who speak to Earth Mother provide tantalizing glimpses of these ancient practices, while later classical commentators like Pausanias, and Strabo, allude to mysterious ceremonies that remain beyond the reach of male observers, even during their own eras. These forbidden rites encompassed a sophisticated range of spiritual technologies. Dream incubation practices, where priestesses induced prophetic visions through controlled sleep deprivation and herbal preparations. Intricate whisper chants, delivered directly to the sacred oak in voices so low they seemed to merge with the wind itself. Elaborate purification processes involving sacred spring water and burning aromatic herbs. Dawn oracular preparations that required precise astronomical timing, and night silence rituals performed in absolute darkness when the boundary between human and divine consciousness was believed to be most permeable. The consequences for male intrusion into these sacred mysteries were severe and unambiguous. Men who attempted to mimic these rites or intrude upon them were systematically removed from the rolls, a politely phrased euphemism for exile that often carried implications far more permanent than simple banishment. Several ancient commentaries reference individuals who were struck from the city's record for hearing what only the women must hear. In the brutal realities of ancient Greek civic life, erasure from official records frequently served as a bureaucratic precursor to physical elimination, effectively making the transgressor a non-person who could be killed without legal consequences. The human details of these exclusive ceremonies reveal their profound psychological and spiritual sophistication. Dodona's priestesses deliberately slept directly on the bare earth without cushions or barriers, believing that this intimate contact allowed the goddess's wisdom to enter their dreams through direct physical connection with the sacred ground. They wore distinctive leather belts hand-carved with angular, rune-like markings that supposedly represented the voice of the oak translated into human symbols, a form of divine script that only initiated women could properly interpret. During the most sacred ceremonies, their hair was left completely unbound, flowing freely as a symbol of openness to divine whispers that might come from any direction. The extreme secrecy surrounding these practices wasn't arbitrary religious exclusivity, but reflected a fundamental theological principle that governed Dodona's entire operation. The women's rites were believed to serve as essential spiritual preparation that primed the oracle for accurate prophecy. Without these hidden ceremonies, the dream incubations, the whispered communications with the goddess, the purification rituals that cleansed both the sacred space and the priestess's consciousness, the gods would simply refuse to speak through the public oracle. This made women's secret knowledge absolutely foundational to the entire religious enterprise, not merely supplementary or decorative. Allowing men to witness or attempt to imitate these preparatory rites posed an existential threat to the oracle's legitimacy and effectiveness. If males could access the same spiritual techniques and claim direct communication with the divine, it would undermine the unique authority of the priestesses and potentially contaminate the sacred processes through inappropriate masculine energy. The theological framework underlying Dodona's operations held that certain forms of divine communication could only occur through specifically feminine spiritual channels that had been properly prepared through secret knowledge passed down through generations of women. This pattern of female ritual exclusivity at Dodona demonstrates how ancient Greece, despite its reputation for male-dominated public life, recognized and protected certain spheres where women's spiritual authority was considered both divinely mandated and politically essential. The state treated female ritual knowledge as simultaneously a sacred divine channel and a potential political danger that required careful control and absolute secrecy. The priestesses of Dodona possessed knowledge that could influence the fate of city-states, military campaigns, and individual lives, power that demanded the ultimate protection of absolute secrecy enforced through lethal consequences. Picture an underground shrine carved from dark volcanic stone, deep beneath the bustling markets of Merib, the legendary capital of the Sabaean kingdom. Flickering oil lamps cast dancing orange halos across walls, meticulously etched with intricate crescent symbols, each curve and line representing centuries of accumulated lunar wisdom. Aromatic frankincense and myrrh, the precious resins that made these desert kingdoms fabulously wealthy, smolder in deep stone bowls carved from black basalt, filling the subterranean air with thick, honey-scented smoke that seems to pulse with each breath. In this sacred chamber, Isolated from the harsh desert sun and the masculine world of trade and warfare above, women gather in the profound silence of night to chant in soft, hypnotic unison to the moon, a goddess whose sacred name appears on countless inscriptions throughout southern Arabia, but whose deepest mysteries were absolutely forbidden to men. The official narrative surrounding pre-Islamic southern Arabian religion presents a sanitized picture of inclusivity and gender equality. According to this conventional interpretation, the great kingdoms of Saba, Qataban, and Himyar practiced mixed-gender worship of major deities like Almaka, the sun god, and Atar, the Venus deity. Religious rituals, we are told, were communal affairs where men and women participated together in public ceremonies, seasonal festivals, and agricultural rites. This version emphasizes the sophisticated theological systems these civilizations developed, while carefully avoiding any suggestion of gender-based religious segregation that might complicate modern assumptions about ancient Arabian society. However, the documented truth preserved in stone tells an entirely different story. Sabaean and Qatabanian inscriptions discovered throughout Yemen and southern Saudi Arabia reveal a complex network of exclusively female lunar rituals that operated parallel to, and often in tension with, the public religious ceremonies dominated by male priests and tribal leaders. Multiple inscriptions, including the extensively studied CIH 621 found near the Great Dam of Marib, and the fragmentary but revealing J23-9 discovered in the ruins of Timna, contain explicit warnings directed at men who might consider violating the absolute sanctity of women's nocturnal moon offerings. The penalties specified in these ancient legal codes are both varied and severe, reflecting the serious threat that male intrusion posed to these sacred practices. Violations could result in crushing ritual fines calculated to impoverish entire families, public shaming ceremonies that destroyed social standing within tightly knit clan structures, complete removal from clan protections that left individuals vulnerable to violence and exploitation, elaborate ritual punishments designed to appease the offended lunar deities, and in several damaged but still partially legible passages, the ultimate penalty of death administered through traditional methods of execution. One particularly well-preserved inscription, found in the ruins of an ancient temple complex, reads with chilling clarity, "If a man enters the chamber of the women in the moon's night, let him be given to judgment." The formal language suggests this wasn't merely a religious prohibition, but an established legal principle backed by state authority. Another fragmentary text, pieced together from scattered stone fragments, appears to specify ritual execution by stoning or abandonment in the desert, both common punishments for severe religious violations in ancient Arabian society, where the harsh environment made exile equivalent to a death sentence. The archaeological evidence provides fascinating insights into the human dimensions of these exclusive ceremonies. Clay figurines excavated from Sabaean sites consistently depict women wearing distinctive crescent-shaped pectorals made from hammered silver or gold, ornamental pieces believed to contain secret chants, protective formulas, or miniature scrolls inscribed with lunar incantations passed down through maternal lineages. Their hair is invariably arranged in elaborate moon coils, a complex braiding style that appears repeatedly in stone reliefs, bronze sculptures, and ceramic figurines specifically associated with female ritual specialists and lunar priestesses. The underground shrines themselves functioned as deliberately gendered architectural spaces designed to exclude male participation. These chambers featured narrow entrance passages that required crawling to access, impossibly low ceilings that prevented standing upright, and intricate networks of side chambers and hidden alcoves accessible only to women who possessed the secret knowledge of their layout. The claustrophobic design wasn't accidental. It created an environment that was simultaneously womb-like and cave-like, evoking both feminine reproductive power and the cosmic darkness from which the moon emerged each night. The legal inscriptions make clear that these weren't merely cultural preferences or informal traditions, but legally binding prohibitions enforced through the full power of the state. In kingdoms where royal authority depended on maintaining proper relationships with divine forces that controlled the seasonal rains, essential for survival in harsh desert environments, violations of sacred gender boundaries threatened not just individual spiritual welfare, but collective political stability. The sophistication of these regulatory systems demonstrates that even in the politically fragmented landscape of pre-Islamic Arabia, where rival kingdoms constantly competed for control of lucrative trade routes, there existed remarkable consistency in protecting women's exclusive access to lunar ritual knowledge. This suggests that the prohibition against male intrusion represented a fundamental theological principle that transcended political boundaries and tribal affiliations. The South Arabian evidence reveals how women's ritual authority could be simultaneously celebrated and carefully contained through legal mechanisms that acknowledge its power while strictly limiting its accessibility. These desert kingdoms understood that certain forms of divine knowledge required specifically feminine channels to remain effective, but they also recognized the potential political dangers of allowing such knowledge to spread beyond carefully controlled boundaries. As trade routes carried Arabian merchants north toward the Mediterranean, these traditions of ritual secrecy would encounter an even more rigidly controlled environment where the line between private religious practice and state crime had become deadly sharp. Marble corridors gleam under the steady glow of oil lamps in the heart of the Roman Forum, their polished surfaces reflecting centuries of political power and religious devotion. The air carries the mingled scents of imported olive oil, sun-warmed travertine stone, and the faint but persistent aroma of sacred incense that has burned continuously for over 6 centuries. Within the secluded house of the Vestals, 6 women of impeccable lineage tend a flame that represents the eternal soul of Rome itself, a fire that must never be allowed to die, for its extinction would herald the collapse of the greatest empire the world has ever known. But behind the carefully cultivated public image of serene, virginal priestesses devoted to simple ritual maintenance lies something far more politically dangerous. Classified ritual knowledge so sensitive that any man who witnessed it faced immediate execution without trial. The official narrative surrounding the Vestal Virgins has been deliberately sanitized to emphasize their symbolic rather than practical importance. According to this conventional interpretation, the Vestals served primarily as guardians of Vesta's sacred fire, functioning as living symbols of Rome's eternal nature and moral purity. Their 30-year vows of chastity supposedly ensured the spiritual well-being of the Roman state through personal sacrifice and religious devotion. This version portrays them as decorative figures, whose main contribution to Roman society was inspirational rather than instrumental, providing reassuring symbols of traditional values in an increasingly complex and morally ambiguous imperial system. However, the documented historical truth reveals that the Vestals wielded far more concrete and potentially dangerous power than popular accounts suggest. These women possessed exclusive knowledge of secret purification and formulas essential to major state ceremonies, binding spells and protective incantations used in crucial legal and military rituals, the precise composition and preparation methods for the suffamen, a holy incense mixture whose effectiveness depended on jealously guarded techniques, elaborate bloodless sacrifice procedures that influenced everything from Senate deliberations to battlefield outcomes, and intricate ritual calendar calculations that determined the timing of critical state functions, including declarations of war, treaty negotiations, and imperial succession ceremonies. Access to the Vestal residence was absolutely forbidden to men under penalty of immediate execution, a prohibition enforced with ruthless consistency that demonstrated Rome's understanding of how dangerous this knowledge could become in the wrong hands. Livy's comprehensive historical accounts and Dionysius of Halicarnassus's detailed constitutional analyses both describe fatal consequences for any man foolish enough to cross the sacred threshold into the Atrium Vestae, or attempt to witness the secret ceremonies performed within its protected chambers. One particularly well-documented case from the late Republican period describes an unfortunate individual who was seized, beaten, and put to death on the spot by the Vestals' armed guards simply for entering their residential quarters, apparently under the mistaken impression that he could petition them directly for divine intervention in a legal matter. The severity of these prohibitions extended beyond mere physical intrusion into forbidden spaces. Even accidentally touching a Vestal virgin outside the controlled context of official state rituals could be interpreted as sacrilege carrying the death penalty. Roman legal precedents established that such contact, regardless of intent, was considered a form of spiritual contamination that threatened both the individual priestess's sacred status and, by extension, Rome's divine protection. The fact that these women were literally untouchable, except under the most carefully regulated circumstances, demonstrates the extraordinary power attributed to their persons and knowledge. The extreme penalties surrounding vestal boundaries reflected a sophisticated understanding that these priestesses didn't merely guard symbolic fire, they served as the guardians of Rome's entire spiritual infrastructure. Their secretly maintained chants, jealously protected ritual formulas, and precisely calculated ceremonial timings directly influenced the effectiveness of legal proceedings where divine approval was sought, military campaigns that required supernatural protection, agricultural rites essential for feeding the empire's vast population, solemn oaths of office that bound magistrates to their duties, and elaborate state purification ceremonies designed to maintain Rome's relationship with the gods, who guaranteed its continued prosperity and expansion. If unauthorized men gained access to this classified knowledge, they could potentially manipulate the fundamental spiritual mechanisms that underpinned Roman political authority. They might alter ritual formulas to curse rather than bless military expeditions, corrupt purification ceremonies to invite divine wrath instead of protection, or use sacred calendar knowledge to time political actions for maximum supernatural advantage. In a society where religious legitimacy was inseparable from political power, such capabilities would represent an existential threat to the established order. The human details surrounding vestal appearance and behavior reveal the careful attention paid to maintaining their distinct status within Roman society. Vestal virgins wore distinctive white wool veils secured with an ornate infula, a sacred headband that marked them as belonging neither to the domestic sphere of wives and mothers, nor to the public sphere of male citizens, but to a unique category of religious authority that transcended normal gender roles. Ritual keys fashioned from precious metals hung from specially woven cords at their waists, each key representing access to secret chambers, sacred texts, or ritual implements whose very existence was known only to initiated priestesses and the highest levels of Roman government. Their elaborate hairstyles, known as the sine crines, required hours of preparation and involved arranging their hair in 6 precisely braided sections that deliberately echoed ancient bridal ceremonies while simultaneously marking their permanent separation from normal female domestic roles. This complex braiding symbolized both their purity and their readiness for divine service that would consume their entire adult lives, transforming them into something that was neither fully human nor entirely divine, but occupied a carefully maintained liminal space between mortal and immortal authority. The Vestal system represents the ultimate evolution of female ritual secrecy in the ancient world, a carefully constructed institution where women's exclusive knowledge became the foundation of imperial power, protected by the full violence of the Roman state and surrounded by deadly prohibitions that would eventually create the most explosive religious scandal in Roman history. Perfumed air hangs thick and intoxicating in the opulent villa of Pompeia, Julius Caesar's wife, on the night of December 4th, 62 BCE. The walls glow with warm golden light from dozens of carefully positioned oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across frescoed scenes of mythological triumph. Ivy garlands, their leaves still glistening with evening dew, drape elegantly across silk-covered couches and marble altar tables laden with sacred offerings. In the largest reception room of the house, dozens of Rome's most influential women gather in reverent silence, their voices hushed to whispers as they prepare for the annual ritual of Bona Dea, the good goddess whose mysterious rites categorically forbid any male presence, knowledge, or participation. The atmosphere crackles with anticipation and female solidarity as matrons, freed women, and even selected household slaves unite in a rare moment of gender-transcendent religious communion. Into this sacred feminine sanctum steps a figure that will transform religious violation into political catastrophe. Publius Clodius Pulcher, ambitious young patrician and notorious rake, disguised laughably as a woman in borrowed robes and a hastily arranged feminine hairstyle. His infiltration of the ceremony represents far more than a reckless prank or youthful indiscretion. It constitutes a deliberate assault on one of Rome's most sacred institutions and triggers what becomes one of the most explosive political crises in the Republic's turbulent history. The official narrative that emerged from subsequent trials and political maneuvering deliberately minimized the severity of Clodius's transgression, characterizing it as a regrettable misunderstanding driven by romantic passion rather than malicious intent. According to this sanitized version, Clodius had merely sought a private meeting with Pompeia and stumbled accidentally into the wrong room at the wrong time. Political opponents seized upon this innocent mistake, the story goes, and exaggerated its significance for partisan advantage. This interpretation treats the entire scandal as a comedic intrusion that was artificially inflated into a major crisis through the machinations of Clodius's enemies, particularly the orator Cicero, who harbored personal grudges against the young patrician. However, the documented truth reveals that the Bona Dea rites were among the most strictly gender-segregated ceremonies in all of Roman religious practice, protected by legal prohibitions that carried severe penalties including exile, massive fines, and social destruction. Men were forbidden not merely from attending these sacred gatherings, but from possessing any knowledge whatsoever of their ritual content, symbolic meaning, or ceremonial procedures. The goddess herself was believed to become violently hostile toward male presence, and her anger could manifest in everything from personal curses to citywide disasters that threatened the entire Roman community. When Clodius infiltrated the ceremony, he simultaneously violated multiple overlapping systems of Roman authority, sacred religious law that protected the goddess's exclusive relationship with women, deeply rooted social taboos that maintain gender boundaries essential to Roman identity, rigid class distinctions that governed interactions between patricians and the broader female community, and the fundamental principle of women's ritual autonomy that allowed them this single sphere of independent religious authority within an otherwise male-dominated society. The immediate fallout from this violation was nothing short of catastrophic for Roman political stability. The revelation of Clodius's presence triggered a cascade of legal proceedings, public riots, political purges, massive financial penalties, and reputational destruction that spread throughout the highest levels of Roman society. Even Julius Caesar, though not directly implicated in the scandal, was forced to divorce Pompeia with the famous declaration that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, demonstrating how the contamination from this religious violation threatened to destroy anyone associated with it. Cicero's detailed speeches about the incident, preserved in multiple manuscripts and extensively analyzed by later historians, describe scenes of absolute chaos when the assembled matrons discovered Clodius's presence among them. Ritual objects that had been carefully prepared for the ceremony were smashed by outraged women who understood that the sacred space had been irreparably polluted by male intrusion. The sense of spiritual and personal violation was so intense that even bitter political enemies temporarily united in their condemnation of Clodius's actions, recognizing that this transgression threatened fundamental principles that transcended partisan politics. The human details surrounding the Bona Dea rites reveal their profound psychological and social significance within Roman women's lives. During these ceremonies, participants wore garlands of fresh ivy and myrtle that symbolized renewal and female fertility, while carrying ritual snakes crafted from intricately knotted wool, ancient symbols of healing wisdom and feminine power that connected them to pre-Roman goddesses whose worship had survived centuries of cultural transformation. Notably absent from these gatherings was wine, the masculine beverage associated with public banquets and political meetings. Instead, participants shared milk that was actually wine euphemistically renamed to maintain the fiction of feminine purity and separation from male social customs. The ritual space filled with haunting music, performed exclusively by women, hypnotic chanting in ancient Latin formulas, and clouds of exotic incense imported from across the Mediterranean. These sensory elements combined to create an otherworldly atmosphere where normal social hierarchies temporarily dissolved, and women from vastly different backgrounds could experience genuine religious communion impossible in Rome's rigidly stratified daily life. The extreme secrecy surrounding these ceremonies wasn't merely symbolic or traditional. It represented a legally protected, spiritually sanctified, and socially essential space where Roman women could exercise religious authority independent of male oversight or interference. The Clodius scandal revealed that beneath Rome's confident imperial facade lay a deep and abiding fear, not of foreign enemies or divine wrath, but of women's mysteries that remained beyond masculine understanding or control. This fear would prove prophetic, for far to the northwest, Roman legions advancing into Gaul and Britain were about to encounter Celtic priestesses whose ritual knowledge would inspire military resistance that threatened the empire's very survival. Mist rolls across the jagged black cliffs of Mona, the sacred island known today as Anglesey, where the Irish Sea pounds relentlessly against ancient stone, carved by millennia of wind and wave. Below, Roman legionaries, veterans of campaigns across 3 continents who have faced Germanic berserkers, Parthian cataphracts, and Egyptian war elephants without flinching, stand frozen in their battle formations, bronze shields raised defensively, their eyes wide with a terror that no amount of military training has prepared them to confront. On the precipitous cliff tops above them, silhouetted against a sky heavy with storm clouds, a line of women wrapped in dark woolen cloaks chant in eerie, rhythmic unison that seems to harmonize with the crash of waves and the shriek of seabirds. They raise torches dipped in rendered animal fat that burns with an otherworldly light, sending showers of sparks cascading across their paint-streaked faces like falling stars against the gathering dusk. The official narrative surrounding Druidism has been systematically distorted by Roman propaganda and later Christian chroniclers who had their own reasons for minimizing women's religious authority. According to this carefully constructed interpretation, Druidic society was dominated by male priests who controlled all significant religious, legal, and educational functions within Celtic communities. Female seers, when mentioned at all, are dismissed as mythological figures or minor practitioners of folk magic who possess no real institutional power or genuine spiritual authority. This version emphasizes the masculine nature of Druidic learning, portraying the tradition as a sophisticated but ultimately patriarchal system that resembled Greek or Roman religious hierarchies. However, the documented historical truth, preserved in Roman military accounts, tells a dramatically different story. Tacitus's meticulously detailed annals, written by a historian who had access to first-hand reports from the British campaigns, explicitly records Roman soldiers being paralyzed by overwhelming fear at the sight of female seers conducting elaborate death rites on the sacred island of Mona during Suetonius Paulinus's assault in 60 CE. These women's ceremonies were conducted in complete gender isolation. No male druids participated, no male spectators were permitted, and the exclusivity was enforced through both religious taboo and physical violence. Celtic tribal law, preserved in fragmentary Irish legal texts and Welsh mythological cycles that retain traces of pre-Christian legal traditions, indicates that men who violated these sacred female rites within their own communities faced severe consequences ranging from ritual cursing that could destroy their social standing to outright execution carried out by the female seers themselves or their male kinsmen who understood the gravity of such transgressions. The punishment wasn't merely for religious violation, but for disrupting the delicate spiritual balance that these women maintained between the world of the living and the dangerous realm of the other world. Roman military sources, compiled by officers who observed these ceremonies from a safe distance, describe haunting ritual keening that could be heard for miles across water and moorland, intricate curse formulas chanted in ancient Celtic dialects that predated Latin influence, complex divination procedures involving carved bones, polished stones, and the entrails of sacrificed animals, elaborate fire rites conducted exclusively by women who had undergone years of secret initiation, and blood prophecies performed in hidden groves where male presence was absolutely forbidden under penalty of death. The Romans, with their characteristic mixture of arrogance and pragmatism, initially interpreted these demonstrations as sophisticated psychological warfare designed to demoralize their troops through supernatural terror. Roman military manuals from the period actually contain specific instructions for dealing with barbarian witchcraft and recommend various countermeasures, including the use of Christian symbols, protective amulets, and group singing to maintain morale when confronted by Celtic female seers. However, the persistence of Roman fear and the detailed accounts of soldiers refusing orders when faced with these women suggests that the terror they inspired went far deeper than mere tactical intimidation. Celtic oral tradition, preserved in medieval Irish and Welsh manuscripts that scholars have traced back to pre-Roman sources, suggests that these exclusive female rites represented far more than psychological warfare or primitive superstition. The women who conducted them served as specially trained mediums capable of facilitating communication between the living community and the dangerous but necessary realm of the otherworld, a parallel dimension where the spirits of the dead continued to influence earthly affairs and where the gods dwelt in forms too powerful for direct human contact. The human details recorded by Roman observers reveal the profound theatrical and psychological sophistication of these ceremonies. The female seer's torches burned with thick, acrid black smoke created by adding specific organic compounds to the animal fat, producing an unnatural fog-like shroud that obscured their movements and created the illusion that they were materializing from and disappearing into the mist itself. Their distinctive cloaks were fastened with intricately carved bone pins engraved with spiral designs meant to invoke the protection of ancestral spirits and facilitate communication with otherworldly powers that could influence the outcome of battles, the fertility of crops, and the fate of entire tribes. Their ritual chants followed complex musical patterns that rose and fell like ocean waves hitting rock, creating an hypnotic effect that seemed to synchronize with natural rhythms and induce altered states of consciousness in both participants and observers. These vocalizations incorporated ancient Celtic words and phrases that had been preserved unchanged for centuries, maintaining their power through precise transmission from one generation of female seers to the next. The fact that even Rome's disciplined professional armies, legions that had conquered most of the known world through superior organization, equipment, and tactical doctrine, hesitated and faltered when confronted by Celtic women's rites demonstrates that we are witnessing not a regional anomaly, but a manifestation of universal principles governing women's exclusive ritual authority. This pattern of female religious power that could inspire fear in male warriors appears across cultures and continents, suggesting fundamental aspects of human spiritual experience that transcended particular religious traditions or cultural contexts. When Roman military might encountered Celtic women's mysteries on the windswept cliffs of Britannia, it revealed the limits of imperial power when faced with forms of authority that operated according to entirely different principles than those governing masculine political and military institutions. Inside a reed-walled birthing room in the heart of Tenochtitlan, the great island capital of the Aztec Empire, obsidian blades catch the flickering light of copal incense as they lie, arranged beside steaming clay bowls filled with carefully prepared herbal mixtures. The air thrums with tension as a laboring woman's contractions intensify, her body becoming a battlefield where life struggles against death in the cosmic drama that the Aztecs understood to be the fundamental nature of existence. A newborn's first cry suddenly pierces the humid air, but this sound of triumph is almost drowned out by the midwife's powerful voice, chanting sacred words in ancient Nahuatl that have been absolutely forbidden to male ears for centuries. These aren't simple birthing songs or comforting lullabies, but war magic of the most potent kind, verbal weapons that could reshape reality itself if wielded by the wrong hands. The official narrative surrounding Aztec midwives has been sanitized by both Spanish colonial chroniclers and modern historians who prefer to minimize the sophisticated theological and military dimensions of Mesoamerican women's roles. According to this conventional interpretation, these women functioned simply as traditional birth attendants who delivered babies using practical knowledge of herbs, positioning, and basic medical techniques. Their work, while respected within their communities, is portrayed as fundamentally domestic and separate from the masculine spheres of warfare, politics, and high religious ceremony that dominated Aztec public life. This version emphasizes their nurturing, maternal qualities, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that they possess knowledge or authority that might challenge established gender hierarchies. However, the documented truth, preserved in the invaluable Florentine Codex compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún, reveals something far more extraordinary and politically significant than simple medical assistance. Aztec midwives conducted elaborate rituals that deliberately paralleled and invoked the same spiritual forces used in battlefield ceremonies, creating a direct theological connection between childbirth and warfare that fundamentally transformed how both activities were understood within Aztec cosmology. The process of giving birth was conceptualized not as a natural biological function, but as a form of literal warfare where women fought against death itself to bring new warriors into the world. This martial understanding of childbirth created a unique category of female warrior that existed nowhere else in Mesoamerican society. Women who died during labor were automatically elevated to the sacred status of Cihuateteo, revered warrior spirits whose sacrifice was considered equal to that of male soldiers who died in battle or on the sacrificial altar. These fallen mothers were believed to accompany the sun on its daily journey across the sky, sharing the same celestial honors accorded to the most celebrated military heroes and receiving the same ritual veneration reserved for those who had died gloriously in service to the empire. The chants that midwives spoke during labor represented the verbal component of this spiritual warfare, functioning as a form of war magic so powerful and dangerous that men were absolutely forbidden from hearing, learning, or repeating them under penalty of severe punishment. The Florentine Codex explicitly records the prohibition: "No man shall hear the warrior woman's words." This wasn't merely a cultural preference or traditional custom, but a legally enforced restriction backed by state authority and religious sanction. The reason for such extreme secrecy becomes clear when we understand that the ritual linguistics used by midwives directly overlapped with verbal spells and incantations, employed to prepare male warriors for battle. These chants invoked the same deities, used identical sacred formulas, and called upon the same supernatural forces that gave Aztec armies their legendary ferocity and tactical effectiveness. If men gained unauthorized access to this knowledge, they could potentially misuse these powerful verbal weapons for personal advantage, corrupt them through improper application, or misunderstand their sacred nature in ways that might anger the gods and bring disaster upon the entire community. The punishment for male listeners was severe and unambiguous. The Codex implies that men who deliberately overheard these chants or attempted to mimic them faced consequences ranging from ritual humiliation, designed to destroy their social standing within the community, to outright execution carried out through traditional methods of sacrifice that would appease the offended deities and restore cosmic balance. The severity of these penalties reflected the Aztec understanding that certain forms of knowledge were inherently gendered, and that violation of these boundaries threatened not just individual spiritual welfare, but the stability of the entire social and cosmic order. The human details of these birthing ceremonies reveal their profound integration of maternal and military symbolism. Midwives painted a distinctive red ochre streak down the laboring mother's nose to give her a warrior's strength, marking her as a combatant engaged in the most sacred form of battle. They tied specially blessed cords around the mother's wrists to anchor her spirit to the world of the living during the dangerous transition when death and life hung in delicate balance. Their chants incorporated explicit references to obsidian blades, the sacred weapons of Aztec warriors, and invoked the protection of eagle warriors, the elite military orders whose courage and skill represented the highest ideals of Aztec masculinity. Midwives also performed complex burial rituals involving the placenta, interring these sacred objects in specific patterns tied to solar cycles and astronomical observations that invoked divine strength and protection for both mother and child. These ceremonies required knowledge of calendrical calculations, astronomical timing, and geographical orientations that connected them to the broader network of priests and ritual specialists who maintained Aztec civilization's relationship with cosmic forces. The fusion of birth and battle in Aztec midwifery created a unique space where women alone held the bridge between life and death, wielding verbal magic that could influence the fate of individuals, families, and the empire itself. This exclusive knowledge represented a form of female power that existed parallel to, but independent from, the masculine military hierarchy, creating a dual system of warrior authority that recognized different but equally valid paths to cosmic honor and spiritual achievement. High in the Andean mountains, female ritual specialists would develop an even more sophisticated understanding of these connections, controlling forces that made war magic seem simple by comparison, the very flow of time itself. High in the rarefied air of the Andes Mountains, massive stone compounds cling to impossible cliffsides, like ancient sentinels overlooking valleys that plunge thousands of feet toward distant jungle floors. The thin mountain atmosphere carries a sharp, metallic taste that burns the lungs of lowland visitors, while perpetual mists swirl around precisely fitted granite blocks that seem to defy both gravity and time itself. Inside the rigorously cloistered Akalakona residence, the sacred houses of the chosen women scattered throughout the vast Inca Empire, the rich yeasty smell of fermenting maize beer fills courtyards where women move with deliberate ritual precision that reflects years of intensive training in mysteries that remained hidden from all masculine observers. These compounds, built into mountainsides at elevations where only the most sacred activities could take place, housed knowledge so dangerous that the penalty for unauthorized male intrusion was immediate execution without appeal. The official narrative surrounding the Atzila, or chosen women of the Inca Empire, has been systematically minimized by both Spanish colonial chroniclers and modern historians who struggle to comprehend the sophisticated spiritual and political roles these women occupied within Andean civilization. According to this sanitized interpretation, the Atzila functioned essentially as palace servants who specialized in domestic arts, weaving fine textiles for royal use, brewing ceremonial chicha beer for state banquets, and maintaining the cleanliness and order of imperial residences. This version portrays them as skilled artisans whose work, while valued by the ruling elite, remained fundamentally supportive rather than authoritative, existing entirely within traditional feminine spheres of domestic production and aesthetic refinement. However, the documented historical truth, preserved in detailed chronicles by observers like Garcilaso de la Vega, who possessed intimate knowledge of Inca customs through his royal indigenous ancestry, reveals that the Atzila functioned as highly trained ritual specialists whose responsibilities encompassed far more than domestic labor. These women served as the exclusive keepers of lunar ceremonies that regulated the entire imperial calendar, complex sacrificial rites that maintained the empire's relationship with mountain deities, and sophisticated calendrical knowledge so crucial to Inca civilization that unauthorized male access to it was punished by immediate execution carried out by state authorities. Spanish colonial administrative records, preserved in Lima's archives and discovered by modern researchers, contain extensive documentation of severe punishments meted out to men who attempted to see, communicate with, or gain entry to Akla compounds without proper imperial authorization. These weren't isolated incidents, but systematic enforcement of regulations that treated infiltration of women's sacred spaces as a form of treason against the Inca state itself. In many regions throughout the empire, particularly in the sacred valleys surrounding Cusco, any unauthorized male presence in Akala areas was automatically classified as a capital crime, regardless of intent or circumstances. The extreme protection surrounding these women reflected their central role in maintaining the complex spiritual infrastructure upon which Inca political authority depended. Atzila knowledge encompassed the precise determination of ritual timing for everything from planting ceremonies to military campaigns, elaborate purification cycles that cleansed communities of spiritual contamination, the scheduling of human and animal sacrifices that appeased mountain spirits and solar deities, intricate agricultural calendars that synchronized farming activities across diverse ecological zones, and most crucially, the ceremonial legitimacy of the emperor himself, whose divine status required constant ritual reinforcement through ceremonies that only trained women could properly perform. Their most sophisticated and closely guarded knowledge involved the creation and interpretation of intricate weaving patterns that functioned as proto-quipu recording systems. These women wove symbolic knots into white vicuña wool cloth to mark lunar phases, ritual days, astronomical observations, and calendrical calculations that formed the foundation of Inca temporal organization. Unlike the more famous quipu cord systems used by male administrators for recording numerical data, These textile-based information storage methods operated according to principles that remained comprehensible only to women who had undergone years of specialized training in sacred mathematics and astronomical observation. The complexity of this knowledge system explains why the Inca state invested such enormous resources in protecting it from unauthorized access. If enemy men learned the specific techniques for calculating ritual timing, they could potentially disrupt Inca ceremonies by performing competing rituals at astronomically significant moments, corrupting the empire's relationship with divine forces and undermining imperial legitimacy at its most fundamental level. Even more dangerously, they might use this knowledge to predict and exploit vulnerable moments in the Inca ceremonial calendar, timing military attacks or political rebellions to coincide with periods when the emperor's divine protection was believed to be weakened. The human details surrounding Akala daily life reveal the profound integration of practical and spiritual responsibilities that characterize their unique position within Inca society. These women wore plain but immaculately maintained white garments woven from the finest alpaca fiber, their simplicity symbolizing purity, while their perfect condition demonstrated the meticulous attention to detail required for all sacred activities. They carried small woven pouches containing carefully selected coca leaves reserved exclusively for ceremonial use, each leaf blessed according to ancient protocols that connected them to the sacred landscape of the Andes Mountains. Their distinctive hairstyles involved braiding their long black hair into two tight plaits that symbolized the dual phases of the moon, waxing and waning, whose cyclical movements governed the timing of agricultural activities, religious ceremonies, and political decisions throughout the empire. This symbolic representation of lunar duality extended throughout their ritual activities, which consistently emphasized the balance between opposing forces that Andean cosmology recognized as essential for maintaining cosmic harmony. The Axela system demonstrates how female ritual timekeepers across continents wielded state-level power that required lethal protection from political authorities who understood that certain forms of knowledge were too dangerous to allow unrestricted access. These mountain priestesses controlled information that could determine the fate of the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, making their protection a matter of imperial survival that justified even the most extreme measures. Night descends upon a traditional Yoruba village in what is now southwestern Nigeria, transforming the central marketplace into a sacred arena where ancient spiritual forces converge with human celebration. Wooden masks carved with elaborate sculptural representations of feminine coiffures, towering headdresses, intricate braided patterns, and ornate head wraps that speak to centuries of aesthetic tradition gleam mysteriously in the dancing firelight cast by palm oil torches arranged in precise ritual configurations. Women move through this illuminated space with slow, deliberate choreography that seems to bend the very air around them, each gesture carrying layers of meaning, accumulated through generations of carefully transmitted knowledge. Drums crafted from hollowed tree trunks and stretched animal hides pound in hypnotic polyrhythmic patterns that vibrate through the red earth beneath bare feet, creating a sonic foundation that connects the living community to ancestral spirits dwelling in the realm beyond ordinary perception. The official narrative surrounding Gala Day festivities has been systematically simplified by both colonial administrators and contemporary cultural observers who struggle to comprehend the sophisticated theological and social systems embedded within what appears to be colorful folk celebration. According to this sanitized interpretation, Gala Day represents nothing more than a traditional festival designed to celebrate mothers and feminine contributions to Yoruba community life. This version emphasizes the theatrical elements, elaborate costumes, energetic dancing, musical performances, while portraying the entire tradition as primarily aesthetic and commemorative, rather than functionally spiritual or politically significant. Modern tourism and cultural preservation efforts often reinforce this interpretation, presenting Gala Day as accessible cultural heritage suitable for public consumption and academic study. However, the documented truth revealed through careful anthropological investigation and the preservation of Yoruba oral traditions tells a dramatically different story about the complex spiritual infrastructure that underlies these public celebrations. Behind the visible festival performances operate extensive women's spiritual societies whose teachings, practices, and ritual knowledge remain absolutely forbidden to male observers or participants. These secret societies maintain exclusive control over crucial community functions, including sophisticated healing rites that address both physical ailments and spiritual imbalances. Elaborate ancestral invocation ceremonies that maintain communication between the living and the dead. Powerful curse formulas capable of punishing wrongdoers and protecting the innocent. Closely guarded fertility secrets that influence agricultural productivity and human reproduction. Intricate ritual choreography whose movements encode theological principles and protective spells that shield communities from natural disasters, enemy attacks, and supernatural threats. The consequences for men who violated these sacred boundaries through deliberate intrusion or accidental observation were severe and multifaceted, reflecting the serious threat that unauthorized masculine access posed to both individual women and the broader spiritual welfare of Yoruba communities. Documented punishments included public shaming ceremonies designed to destroy social standing and reputation, complete exile from the community that effectively meant social death, community-driven punishment involving boycotts and ostracism that made economic survival impossible, ritual retaliation carried out by the offended spiritual societies themselves, and in earlier historical periods before colonial legal systems disrupted traditional justice mechanisms, physical elimination that was strongly implied in oral accounts, though rarely explicitly described. Colonial ethnographers working in Nigeria during the early 20th century, often completely baffled by the elaborate secrecy surrounding women's spiritual activities, noted with frustrated fascination that elder women would etch complex symbolic patterns into the dirt immediately before major performances. Geometric designs, abstract representations, and coded markings whose meanings remained comprehensible only to women who had undergone years of intensive initiation into the deepest levels of Gelede knowledge. These ephemeral symbols functioned as a sophisticated communication system that could convey coded blessings for community prosperity, specific warnings about spiritual dangers threatening the village, or detailed instructions for ritual procedures that required precise timing and coordination among multiple participants. The human details surrounding Gelede ceremonies reveal their profound integration of aesthetic beauty and spiritual power that characterize the most sophisticated forms of African religious expression. Elder women responsible for directing these sacred activities wore thick, elaborately crafted beaded anklets that rattled softly with each measured step, creating subtle musical accompaniment that enhanced the hypnotic effect of the larger percussion ensemble while marking their movement through sacred space with audible precision. Their wooden masks, carved by specialist artisans according to ancient protocols, functioned not merely as decorative elements, but as physical manifestations of our mothers, a complex spiritual concept that encompassed feminine authority operating across multiple dimensions of existence, generational knowledge that connected living women to countless ancestral mothers, and metaphysical force that could influence everything from weather patterns to political decisions within Yoruba communities. The theological sophistication underlying Gelede practices demonstrates that these traditions represent far more than regional African customs, but rather sophisticated spiritual technologies that developed independently within Yoruba civilization, yet conform to universal patterns of female ritual authority that appear across cultures and continents. The fact that these knowledge systems required protection through severe punishment for male intrusion indicates their fundamental importance to community survival and spiritual welfare, rather than mere cultural preference or arbitrary gender discrimination. What makes the Yoruba evidence particularly significant for understanding global patterns of women's ritual secrecy is that Gelede represents neither Greek nor Roman tradition, neither Mesoamerican nor Near Eastern religious practice, but distinctly African spiritual technology that developed according to its own internal logic and cultural imperatives. Yet, the underlying structure, women's exclusive access to crucial ritual knowledge protected by severe punishment for male violation, remains identical to examples found across 3 continents, spanning over 3,500 years of recorded history, and manifesting in cultural contexts ranging from vast empires to small tribal communities. This remarkable consistency suggests that we are witnessing not random cultural coincidences, but fundamental principles of human spiritual organization that transcend particular religious traditions, geographical boundaries, or historical periods. The universal appearance of women's secret ritual knowledge, protected by lethal consequences for masculine intrusion, indicates deep structural realities about the relationship between gender, power, and sacred knowledge that operated according to principles that remain largely mysterious to contemporary understanding, but were clearly recognized and respected by countless ancient civilizations across the globe. The torches burn low in the intricate subterranean chambers beneath the labyrinthine palace of Knossos, their wavering flames casting hypnotic shadows across vividly painted frescoes depicting blue-skinned goddesses with serpents writhing through their upraised fingers, endless spiraling patterns that seem to pulse with otherworldly energy, and sacred bulls whose curved horns frame scenes of ritual transformation that speak to mysteries lost for over 3 millennia. The air in these buried sanctuaries is warm and almost humid despite the stone surroundings, thick with the mingled scents of ceremonial olive oil, fired clay vessels, and something far older, an indefinable essence of sanctity that seems to permeate the very walls themselves. In the flickering torchlight, women move through these sacred spaces in slow, precisely controlled circles, live serpents coiling gracefully around their bare arms, wrists, and shoulders, as though the reptiles were integral components of an ancient choreography designed to bridge the gap between human consciousness and divine presence. The official narrative surrounding Minoan civilization has been deliberately romanticized by modern archaeologists and popular historians who prefer to emphasize its supposedly peaceful, aesthetic, and artistic qualities, rather than confronting the complex spiritual and political realities that governed Europe's first advanced civilization. According to this sanitized interpretation, Minoan religion represented a harmonious, egalitarian system focused primarily on nature worship, artistic expression, and cultural sophistication. This version presents Minoan society as an idyllic Bronze Age paradise populated by elegant people who created beautiful frescoes, sophisticated pottery, and harmless female figurines that reflected their supposedly gentle and non-violent approach to both spiritual and political life. However, the documented archaeological evidence excavated from major Minoan sites across Crete tells a far more complex and spiritually sophisticated story about the hidden dimensions of Bronze Age religious practice. The massive temple complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, and Gornia contain extensive networks of restricted access female shrines that were deliberately designed to exclude unauthorized observers through architectural features that made infiltration nearly impossible. These sacred chambers could only be reached through narrow corridors that forced visitors to crawl single file, steep stairways that descended deep underground away from public areas, or ingenious trapdoor-like entrances that could be sealed completely when ceremonies were in progress, creating impenetrable barriers between the sacred activities conducted within and the ordinary palace life occurring above. The fragmentary linear A tablets discovered throughout Minoan sites, though still undeciphered by modern scholars, contain repeated instances of specific gender markers associated with distinct ritual roles, strongly suggesting the existence of elaborate ceremonial systems that maintain strict separation between masculine and feminine spiritual responsibilities. The linguistic patterns visible in these ancient texts indicate that certain religious functions were exclusively assigned to women, while others remained accessible to men, creating a complex hierarchy of ritual authority that operated according to principles we can only partially reconstruct from archaeological evidence. The famous snake figurines that have become iconic symbols of Minoan civilization appear overwhelmingly in archaeological contexts associated with women's quarters and specialized ritual storerooms, rather than in public ceremonial areas or spaces connected to masculine activities. This distribution pattern suggests that serpent-centered religious practices functioned as specifically feminine spiritual technologies that required exclusive female participation to maintain their effectiveness and sacred character. Several prominent scholars who have dedicated their careers to understanding Minoan religious systems argue that the celebrated snake priestess iconography, visible in frescoes and sculptures, reflects sophisticated ecstatic trance ceremonies that were performed exclusively by specially trained women who had undergone years of preparation in handling dangerous reptiles and inducing altered states of consciousness. The serpents themselves, rather than serving as mere symbolic elements or decorative motifs, functioned as living conduits of divine presence that could facilitate direct communication between human priestesses and chthonic deities dwelling in the underground realm of the dead. Archaeological evidence confirms that men were systematically excluded from these core serpent ceremonies. Excavated temple areas show no evidence whatsoever of male participation in the central snake-handling rituals, while several frescoes explicitly depict men waiting in peripheral courtyards or outer chambers, while women perform the most sacred rites in inner sanctuaries that remained completely off-limits to masculine observers. The physical layout of these religious complexes demonstrates deliberate architectural segregation designed to maintain absolute separation between male and female ritual activities. The extreme secrecy surrounding these practices reflected their connection to some of the most powerful and dangerous spiritual forces recognized by Minoan civilization. These women-only rites created direct links between human practitioners and chthonic powers that governed agricultural fertility, underworld deities who controlled the fate of the dead, sophisticated forms of earth magic that could influence everything from earthquake activity to crop yields, complex fertility cycles that synchronized human reproduction with seasonal changes, and elaborate trance invocations involving live serpents that could induce prophetic visions or divine possession. These ceremonies represented genuine spiritual technologies rather than mere theatrical performances, requiring precise knowledge and years of training to execute safely. The human details preserved in Minoan artistic representations reveal the profound symbolic sophistication underlying these exclusive female ceremonies. Snake priestesses wore distinctive layered wool skirts dyed in sacred colors, bronze arm cuffs inscribed with protective symbols, and characteristic open front bodices that revealed their breasts, not for erotic display or masculine titillation, but as symbols of feminine creative power and spiritual potency that connected them to breast-bearing goddess figures who governed fertility and regeneration. Their ritual movements, described in later Greek commentaries that preserved fragmentary memories of Minoan practices, were believed to literally call the divine into the body, transforming human women into temporary vessels for otherworldly consciousness. While Minoan written records remain largely fragmentary and undecipherable, making direct documentation of punishment for ritual violation impossible, several archaeological scholars point to elaborate physical barriers and security measures that were clearly designed to prevent unauthorized entry into the most sacred chambers. Given the well-documented parallels with other Bronze Age Mediterranean civilizations, especially considering that Crete was a society where ritual bull-leaping deaths were systematically incorporated into religious ceremonies, scholarly consensus suggests that violation of exclusive female spiritual boundaries would have incurred severe consequences, quite possibly including ritual execution designed to appease the offended chthonic powers and restore cosmic balance. The Minoan evidence demonstrates that Europe's earliest high civilization placed its most powerful and spiritually dangerous rituals exclusively in women's hands, creating a pattern of female religious authority that would influence Mediterranean spiritual traditions for millennia to come. Cold wind howls across the endless Eurasian steppe, carrying with it the harsh scents of dried grass, distant snow, and the metallic tang of approaching storms that could devastate entire herds in a matter of hours. Beneath a sky darkened by racing clouds, a ring of women wrapped in thick, intricately embroidered woolen cloaks kneel in protective formation around a carefully tended fire that sends sparks spiraling into the turbulent air above. Bone talismans carved with ancient symbols swing rhythmically from braided leather cords as the women sway in unison, their movements synchronized with chants in archaic Scythian dialects that preserve words older than any written language. Smoke rises in deliberate spirals from bundles of burning hemp carefully positioned around the flames, carrying the sweet narcotic scent of sacred vegetation that opens doorways between the world of ordinary perception and the realm where divine forces communicate their will to human interpreters. One woman leans forward with the slow, deliberate movements of deep trance, tracing intricate patterns in the accumulated ash, geometric designs that will reveal the fate of warriors, the location of game, the timing of tribal migrations, and the will of the sky gods who govern the destiny of nomadic peoples. These are the Enari, Scythian priestesses whose prophetic abilities were so renowned and feared that even the most hardened steppe warriors, men who had survived decades of constant warfare against Persian armies, Greek colonists, and rival nomadic tribes, would fall silent in respectful terror when these women entered their divination trances and began speaking with voices that seemed to emerge from realms beyond human comprehension. The official narrative surrounding Scythian civilization has been systematically distorted by both Greek chroniclers and modern historians who struggle to acknowledge the sophisticated spiritual and political roles that women occupied within nomadic societies. According to this conventional interpretation, the Scythians represented a quintessentially male-dominated warrior culture where political authority, military leadership, and religious power were concentrated exclusively in the hands of male chiefs, generals, and shamans. Female participation in spiritual activities, when acknowledged at all, is dismissed as consisting of rare exceptions or marginal practices that existed on the periphery of mainstream Scythian religious life without significantly influencing tribal decision-making or cultural development. However, the documented truth preserved in the detailed ethnographic observations of Herodotus, who had direct access to Scythian informants during his travels through the Black Sea region, reveals a far more complex and spiritually sophisticated understanding of gender roles within steppe society. Herodotus describes the Enare with surprising detail and obvious respect, characterizing them as women and gender variant. Individuals who possessed exclusive knowledge of advanced divination techniques involving the ritual use of linden bark strips, concentrated hemp smoke inhalation, and controlled trance states that allowed communication with divine forces governing tribal fate. These spiritual technologies enabled them to interpret the will of sky gods through fire patterns, predict the outcome of military campaigns through ecstatic motion, and provide guidance on crucial decisions affecting the survival and prosperity of entire nomadic communities. The ritual knowledge possessed by the Enare was both exclusive and carefully protected through severe punishment for unauthorized masculine intrusion. Herodotus explicitly writes that men who attempted to imitate the Enari's sophisticated trance rituals, particularly those involving the deliberate inhalation of hemp vapors or the interpretation of divine signs through fire reading, faced immediate execution. This wasn't simply because these ceremonies were considered sacred to women, but because improper use of such powerful spiritual technologies was believed to anger the sky gods and fundamentally destabilize the delicate supernatural forces that determined tribal fate in the harsh environment of the Eurasian steppe. One particularly revealing Scythian tale, recorded by Greek chroniclers who had witnessed its retelling around nomadic campfires, describes the discovery and punishment of a man who had been secretly observing and attempting to replicate Enari divination rituals. The transgressor was immediately bound with horsehair ropes, subjected to intensive interrogation about his motivations and the extent of his unauthorized knowledge, and then publicly executed for offending the gods, through a ritual method designed to appease the divine forces he had inadvertently corrupted through his inappropriate spiritual activities. Archaeological evidence from Scythian burial mounds, the massive earthen kurgans that dot the steppe landscape from Ukraine to Mongolia, provides compelling material confirmation of the central role that women played in Scythian spiritual life. These excavated sites reveal richly adorned female graves containing sophisticated collections of ritual implements found exclusively with women rather than men, specialized bone tools clearly designed for divination practices, elaborately carved wands and amulets that functioned as instruments of spiritual power, and complex arrangements of ceremonial objects that indicate these women wielded religious authority equal to or greater than the political power exercised by male tribal leaders. The striking contrast is unmistakable. Men were buried with weapons that reflected their roles as warriors and hunters, while women were interred with rituals that demonstrated their function as mediators between human communities and the supernatural forces that governed survival on the steppe. The human details surrounding Inare religious practice reveal the profound integration of practical and spiritual knowledge that characterized the most sophisticated forms of nomadic shamanism. Their distinctive cloaks were thick with meticulously embroidered symbols, chevron patterns representing lightning and divine power, wave designs symbolizing the flow of time and fate, spirals indicating the various possible paths that future events might take, depending on divine will and human action. These garments function not merely as protection against harsh steppe weather, but as wearable sacred texts that encoded complex theological principles and provided visual reference guides for conducting divination ceremonies. The Inare wore elaborate collections of talismans carved from deer bone, animals considered sacred messengers capable of carrying communications between the human world and the realm of ancestral spirits. These bone implements were believed to retain the voices of dead shamans and tribal elders who continued to provide guidance from beyond death, creating a continuous chain of spiritual authority that connected living Inare to centuries of accumulated wisdom about navigating the dangerous intersection between human needs and divine will. Their hair was arranged according to strict protocols and tied back with colored cords that indicated their specific rank within the spiritual hierarchy, their particular areas of expertise, and their level of initiation into the most dangerous and powerful forms of divination practice. These visual markers enabled other tribal members to immediately recognize which Inare possessed the knowledge necessary for addressing specific problems or conducting particular types of ceremonies. The fact that the Eurasian steppe, a region often imagined by outsiders as relentlessly patriarchal and dominated by masculine warrior values, actually protected female ritual power through lethal force demonstrates the universal recognition that certain forms of divine knowledge required specifically feminine channels to remain effective and safe. This pattern would reach its most extreme and mythologically influential form in the wine-dark mountains of Thrace, where female spiritual authority became so powerful and dangerous that later classical writers were forced to soften historical accounts into metaphorical stories that could be safely transmitted without revealing the full extent of women's ritual capabilities. A primeval forest shrouded in the absolute darkness of a moonless night, where ancient oak and pine trees tower like cathedral columns, supporting a canopy so dense it blocks even starlight from reaching the forest floor. Torches made from resin-soaked pine branches crackle and hiss, sending showers of sparks spiraling upward through the humid air, thick with the scent of crushed vegetation, spilled wine, and something far more primal, the metallic tang of blood and the musky odor of wild animals. Drums crafted from hollow tree trunks and stretched hide pound out irregular, hypnotic rhythms that seem to synchronize with heartbeats and breathing, their thunderous echoes reverberating through the darkness like the footsteps of approaching gods. Women dressed in hastily sewn fawn skins, still reeking of the hunt, and crowned with ivy wreaths that drip with fermented grape juice, move in ecstatic, increasingly frenzied circles, their ululating cries rising toward the invisible canopy in wordless communications with divine forces that possess their bodies and transform them into something simultaneously more and less than human. To an uninitiated outsider stumbling upon this scene, the ceremony would appear to be pure chaos, a breakdown of civilized order where rational thought and social control have collapsed into primitive madness. But to the participants themselves, these seemingly random movements represent the highest form of sacred order, divine possession that connects them directly to Dionysus himself, the god of wine, ecstasy, death, and rebirth, whose presence transforms ordinary women into instruments of cosmic will, operating according to principles that transcend human understanding or masculine authority. The official narrative surrounding the Maenads, the frenzied female followers of Dionysus, whose legendary exploits were immortalized in classical Greek literature, has been systematically relegated to the realm of pure mythology by modern scholars who prefer to treat these accounts as literary metaphors rather than historical records of actual religious practices. According to this sanitized interpretation, the most infamous scenes from Euripides' Bacchae, particularly the climactic sequence where King Pentheus is literally torn apart, sparagmos, by wine-maddened women for attempting to spy on their forbidden rites, represent symbolic rather than literal events designed to explore philosophical themes about the tension between rational authority and irrational divine power. This version treats the entire Bacchic tradition as sophisticated theatrical allegory that use shocking imagery to communicate abstract theological principles without describing actual ceremonial practices or real consequences for ritual violation. However, the documented archaeological and historical truth, preserved in both material remains and Roman military accounts, tells a dramatically different story about the genuine dangers surrounding Thracian Bacchic ceremonies. Archaeological investigation of Thracian religious sites, combined with detailed testimony from Roman soldiers stationed in the volatile frontier regions north of Greece, provides compelling evidence that these women-only nighttime ceremonies involved literal ecstatic possession, weaponized trance states that enhanced physical strength and eliminated normal pain responses, and elaborate ritual protocols that absolutely forbade male presence under penalty of immediate and violent death. Roman military chronicles written by officers who witnessed these ceremonies from cautious distances contain repeated references to women whose cries unmanned even the brave, indicating that hardened soldiers who had survived decades of warfare against Germanic tribes, Dacian warriors, and Parthian cavalry found themselves psychologically overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of female Bacchic rituals. Several detailed accounts explicitly mention male intruders being discovered and killed through various methods including ritual dismemberment, beating to death with thyrsus staffs, and formal sacrifice to Dionysus, carried out according to ancient protocols that transformed trespassers into sacred offerings designed to appease the violated god. Ovid's ethnographic writings, based on direct observation of Thracian customs during his exile in the Black Sea region, contain explicit references to local women performing literal sparagmos, the systematic tearing of both animals and human beings limb from limb, as an integral component of their most sacred ceremonies. These accounts describe with clinical precision how possessed women could dismember adult deer, wild boars, and even bulls using only their bare hands and teeth. Their normal human limitations transcended through divine possession that granted them supernatural strength and eliminated conscious awareness of their own actions. Archaeological evidence from excavated Thracian burial sites and religious sanctuaries provides material confirmation of these literary accounts through the discovery of systematically dismembered animal remains associated exclusively with female shrines. Preserved fawn skin garments still bearing traces of ritualistic bloodstains, iron-tipped thyrsus staffs clearly designed as both ceremonial objects and lethal weapons, and stone inscriptions in ancient Thracian dialects warning of divine vengeance that would befall any man foolish enough to intrude upon women's sacred mysteries. Whether the specific story of Pentheus represents literal historical memory or mythologized tradition becomes irrelevant when we consider the overwhelming pattern of evidence indicating that such violent punishments were not only possible but systematically implemented across Thracian territories for centuries. The human details surrounding authentic Bacchic practice reveal the sophisticated psychological and spiritual technologies employed to achieve and maintain the altered states of consciousness essential for divine possession. Maenads carried specially crafted staffs topped with pine cones that concealed sharpened iron spikes capable of inflicting lethal wounds, transforming apparently harmless ritual implements into deadly weapons that could be deployed instantly against intruders. Their faces were deliberately smeared with wine lees, the thick sediment left after fermentation, creating a mask-like appearance that visually marked their transformation from ordinary women into vessels of divine power, while also providing ritual protection against recognition by spirits or enemies. Their hair was left completely unbound and allowed to flow wildly during ceremonies, symbolizing their liberation from normal social constraints, while also enhancing the dramatic visual impact of their possessed movements. In deep trance states induced through combinations of rhythmic drumming, wine consumption, and controlled hyperventilation, groups of Maenads could move with uncanny synchronization, despite the apparent chaos of their individual actions, creating collective choreography that seemed to operate according to supernatural rather than human coordination. The lethal consequences for male intrusion reflected a sophisticated theological understanding that these ceremonies channeled raw, unfiltered divine energy through female bodies that had been specially prepared to serve as vessels for Dionysus himself. A man witnessing these rites wasn't merely violating social taboo or disrespecting religious tradition. He was fundamentally disrupting the god's possession of his female devotees, contaminating the sacred space with inappropriate masculine energy, and potentially causing the divine presence to withdraw entirely from the community. The penalty for such interference was necessarily immediate and violent, administered not through human judgment, but through divine will expressing itself through the possessed women who had become temporary incarnations of cosmic justice. This represents the ultimate evolution of women's ritual secrecy from symbolic protection to literal, embodied, lethal enforcement that transcended mere human authority and became an expression of divine will itself. The Thracian evidence demonstrates that certain forms of female spiritual knowledge were considered so dangerous and sacred that their protection required not metaphorical consequences, but immediate physical elimination of any masculine presence that might corrupt or compromise their effectiveness. Clay oil lamps flicker against roughly hewn limestone walls, their dancing flames casting shifting shadows that seem to pulse with the rhythm of ancient grief. Fine dust hangs suspended in the close air of a typical Iron Age dwelling, as women gather in carefully arranged tight semicircles, their voices lifting in sharp, piercing cries that follow patterns refined over countless generations. Their cheeks bear the ritual marks of light scratching, not deep wounds, but symbolic signs of mourning, while their hair is deliberately covered with dust and ash as visible testimony to their participation in humanity's most fundamental confrontation with mortality. This is a Hebrew lamentation guild in action, a highly structured, exclusively female ritual organization that played an essential role in Iron Age Levantine religious and social life, yet whose practices remained absolutely forbidden to masculine participation under penalty of severe community sanctions. The official narrative surrounding ancient Hebrew mourning customs presents a deliberately simplified picture emphasizing universal accessibility and communal participation. According to this sanitized interpretation, public expressions of grief represented inclusive community traditions where anyone, regardless of gender, social status, or ritual training, could spontaneously participate in honoring the dead through emotional displays, vocal expressions of sorrow, and collective demonstrations of loss. This version treats mourning as a natural human response that required no specialized knowledge, formal training, or exclusive ritual authority, portraying it as one of the few areas of ancient life where gender distinctions were supposedly irrelevant and democratic participation was encouraged. However, the documented truth preserved in both canonical biblical texts and extra-biblical archaeological sources reveals a far more complex and professionally organized system of grief management that operated according to strict gender hierarchies and required years of specialized training to master effectively. Biblical passages, particularly the detailed account in Jeremiah 9:17-20, explicitly describe women being formally summoned by prophetic authority to teach mourning rites to others, indicating that lamentation functioned as a genuine profession requiring specific skills, traditional knowledge, and institutional recognition, rather than spontaneous emotional expression. These women underwent intensive training in the sophisticated craft of ritualized grief, mastering complex techniques, including rhythmically structured wails that followed traditional melodic patterns, elaborate antiphonal cries that required precise timing and vocal coordination between multiple participants, and carefully constructed dirges that incorporated theological themes, genealogical information, and community history into their emotional content. The professional nature of this training demonstrates that effective lamentation required far more than raw emotional response. It demanded mastery of musical techniques, memorization of traditional formulas, and understanding of theological principles that governed proper communication between the living and the dead. Most significantly, and contrary to popular assumptions about inclusive mourning practices, men who attempted to mimic or perform these specialized female rites faced serious punishment within their communities. Several Iron Age burial texts discovered throughout the Levantine region, combined with rabbinic commentaries that preserve ancient legal traditions, indicate that performing lamentation as a woman does constituted a dangerous taboo for men that could result in immediate social expulsion from the community or formal ritual penalties designed to address the spiritual contamination caused by inappropriate gender transgression. In some conservative Hebrew communities, masculine participation in female mourning rites was classified as an abomination, requiring elaborate purification ceremonies to restore cosmic balance, or, in extreme cases, permanent removal of the offending individual from communal life. The severity of these consequences reflected a sophisticated theological understanding that certain forms of communication with the dead required specifically feminine spiritual channels to remain effective and spiritually safe. The human details surrounding these lamentation guilds reveal their profound integration of physical, emotional, and spiritual elements designed to facilitate proper transition between life and death. Participating women performed controlled self-injury through light scratching of their cheeks, not to cause genuine harm, but to create visible symbols of internal grief that made their emotional state manifest in physical reality. They wore deliberately torn garments that symbolized the rupture caused by death, while simultaneously demonstrating their willingness to sacrifice material comfort in honor of the deceased. During ceremonies, the women sat on specially designated low stools that placed them closer to the earth and symbolically nearer to the underworld realm where the dead continued their existence. Their elaborately structured lamentations were believed to serve multiple crucial functions, guiding newly deceased souls through the dangerous transition from earthly to spiritual existence, maintaining communication channels between living family members and ancestral spirits who could provide ongoing protection and guidance, and invoking divine compassion for both the dead and the surviving community members who remained vulnerable to divine judgment. The fact that even grief, humanity's most universal experience, carried secrets that men were absolutely forbidden from accessing demonstrates the remarkable extent to which ancient societies recognized and protected, specifically feminine forms of spiritual authority that operated according to principles completely separate from masculine religious and social institutions. A warm, humid chamber deep within a Hittite palace complex, where carefully woven straw mats have been arranged in precise ritual patterns across the polished stone floor. Steam rises in gentle clouds from copper basins, filled with herbal preparations created by experienced midwives who have spent decades mastering the delicate balance of medicinal plants that facilitate safe childbirth and spiritual protection. Women gather in reverent circles around the laboring mother, their voices blending in rhythmic chants that harmonize with the soft crackling of oil lamps positioned at cardinal directions to invoke the protective presence of the mother goddess. This sacred birthing chamber represents far more than a practical medical facility. It functions as a cosmological threshold where the fundamental forces of life and death converge under the exclusive authority of women trained in mysteries that have been absolutely forbidden to masculine observation for countless generations. The official narrative surrounding Hittite and Luwian birthing practices has been systematically minimized by both ancient chroniclers and modern historians who prefer to characterize these ceremonies as simple domestic affairs, managed through practical household wisdom rather than sophisticated religious technology. According to this sanitized interpretation, birth rituals represented nothing more than traditional midwifery supported by folk medicine and family customs, with any spiritual element serving merely as psychological comfort rather than genuine theological necessity. This version treats childbirth as a fundamentally biological process that required no specialized ritual knowledge or exclusive religious authority beyond the practical skills needed for safe delivery. However, the documented truth preserved in detailed Hittite ritual texts, particularly within the extensively studied CTH, Catalog of Hittite Texts, series discovered at Hattusa and other major archaeological sites, explicitly records penalties of immediate execution for any man who dared to enter female purification or birthing chambers during active ceremonies. The legal language is unambiguous and chilling in its directness. If a man enters the women's chamber in impurity, they shall kill him. Another preserved text describes elaborate multi-step rituals involving trained midwives using herbal steam treatments, protective amulets charged with divine power, precisely coordinated rhythmic chants, and complex goddess invocation formulae, all of which remained absolutely forbidden for men to witness or overhear under penalty of death administered by state authorities. The extreme severity of these punishments reflected sophisticated Anatolian theological understanding that childbirth represented a cosmologically dangerous process, where the normally stable boundary between life and death became dangerously thin and permeable. During labor, women existed in a liminal state where they could communicate directly with underworld powers and divine forces that governed human fertility, making them temporary vessels for cosmic energies too powerful for untrained observers to witness safely. Women served as specially trained ritual guardians of purity and spiritual transformation, their accumulated knowledge considered far too potent and dangerous for masculine ears that lacked the proper spiritual preparation to process such information without causing catastrophic contamination. The human details surrounding these birth mysteries reveal their profound integration of medical and spiritual technologies. Midwives wore distinctive amulets shaped like representations of Kubaba, the great goddess of protection, whose divine authority extended over all forms of life transition. They traced elaborate protective circles around laboring mothers using fresh flower petals or specially dyed colored threads that created sacred boundaries impermeable to malevolent spiritual forces. Following successful delivery, they performed intricate closing chants believed to seal the mother's spirit gate, ritual procedures designed to prevent her soul from accidentally following the newborn through the dangerous threshold between worlds and becoming trapped in the realm of death. These birth chambers represented sacred sealed spaces where women wielded life and death authority that operated entirely independent of masculine political or religious institutions, creating an exclusive feminine realm protected by the ultimate sanction of lethal force administered through both divine and earthly justice. Dawn breaks across the endless Eurasian grasslands, painting the vast steppe landscape in shades of gold and crimson that stretch unbroken to the horizon where sky meets earth in a seamless line. The morning air carries the sharp scent of crushed grass, distant snow, and the metallic tang of weapons being prepared for sacred use. Young girls, not yet initiated into the ranks of full warriors, sit cross-legged on woven blankets, carefully sharpening iron-tipped arrows while their experienced hands move with the practiced precision that comes from years of preparation for this moment. Elder women, their faces marked with the ritual scars and tattoos that record decades of battlefield victories, sing haunting ancestry songs in ancient Sarmatian dialects that preserve the names and deeds of warrior mothers stretching back through countless generations. Horses snort and stamp in the cold morning air, their breath creating small clouds of vapor as they await the riders who will soon mount them for ceremonies that will transform girls into members of the most feared female military caste in the ancient world. A ritual circle slowly forms as dozens of women gather for the sacred coming-of-age rite that will mark the transition from childhood to full warrior status. A transformation that requires not only physical prowess and military skill, but also spiritual initiation into mysteries that have remained absolutely forbidden to masculine observation for as long as Sarmatian culture has existed on the steppes. The official narrative surrounding Sarmatian women warriors has been systematically minimized by both ancient Greek chroniclers and modern historians, who prefer to treat these formidable fighters as romantic anomalies, rather than acknowledging the sophisticated military culture that produced them. According to this sanitized interpretation, female warriors represented occasional exceptions to normal steppe gender roles, exotic curiosities that Greek writers exaggerated for dramatic effect, rather than documenting genuine military institutions. This version portrays them as isolated individuals who somehow acquired fighting skills despite their feminine nature, rather than recognizing them as products of systematic training programs designed specifically to create female soldiers. However, the documented archaeological truth tells a dramatically different story that completely contradicts these dismissive interpretations. Extensive excavation of Sarmatian burial mounds across the Black Sea region reveals that nearly one-third of all weapon-rich burials belong to women rather than men, with female graves containing sophisticated collections of composite bows, iron swords, elaborate horse gear, and specialized ritual objects that indicate these women held both military and religious authority within their communities. The sheer statistical prevalence of armed female burials proves that women warriors represented a standard rather than exceptional feature of Sarmatian society. Greek ethnographic sources, written by observers who had direct contact with Sarmatian tribes, describe elaborate women-only initiation ceremonies involving blood oath rituals that bound initiates to their sisters-in-arms, sacred bow offerings that connected them to ancestral warrior spirits, powerful war chants that invoked divine protection in battle, and complex ancestor invocation ceremonies that integrated new warriors into lineages stretching back through generations of female fighters. Most significantly, these sources consistently emphasize that men, including fathers, brothers, and male tribal leaders, were absolutely barred from witnessing any aspect of these transformative rites. Intrusion into these sacred ceremonies was considered a fundamental violation of cosmic order that threatened both individual spiritual welfare and collective tribal survival. Punishment for such violations was administered harshly and, according to several accounts, sometimes lethally, through methods designed to appease the offended warrior spirits and restore the cosmic balance that masculine presence had disrupted. Hippocrates, whose medical writings preserve valuable ethnographic observations about steppe cultures, explicitly notes the existence of the law of women warriors that categorically prohibited male presence during any phase of female military initiation. The human details of these ceremonies reveal their sophisticated integration of spiritual and martial elements designed to create warriors capable of channeling both physical and supernatural power. During the rituals, young initiates wore specially braided horsehair cords that symbolized their mystical connection to the mounts that would become their partners in both battle and spiritual journey. Elder women painted intricate symbolic patterns on the faces of new warriors, geometric lines representing ancestral lineages, dots marking future victories promised by divine prophecy, and crescents invoking the protection of lunar deities who governed the fate of female fighters. These steppe cultures understood that secrecy didn't function primarily to protect women from masculine interference, but rather to protect the extraordinary power that women held from contamination or corruption by inappropriate male presence that could weaken or destroy their effectiveness as both warriors and spiritual guardians. Moonlight filters through the deliberately open roof of a circular stone temple, its ancient granite walls lined with dozens of carved niches housing fierce metal and stone yogini figures whose eyes seem to follow observers with supernatural awareness. The sacred space thrums with otherworldly energy as women move in deep trance states, their bodies tracing slow, hypnotic arcs that follow choreographic patterns preserved unchanged for over a millennium. Bronze bells suspended from the temple's circumference echo with each movement, their metallic voices creating a sonic environment that seems to pulse with divine presence. The humid air clings heavy with the intoxicating scents of burning sandalwood, smoldering camphor, and something deeper, the indefinable essence of power that accumulates in places where the boundary between human and divine consciousness has been repeatedly dissolved through centuries of ritual practice. This is a Shakta Yogini temple in active ceremonial use, representing one of Hinduism's most secretive and spiritually dangerous sacred spaces, dedicated to channeling the fierce feminine energies that Tantric tradition recognizes as the fundamental creative and destructive forces governing cosmic existence. These remarkable circular structures, scattered across rural regions of Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, and other areas where ancient goddess worship survived the arrival of Orthodox Hindu traditions, function as specialized venues for women-only ceremonies that have remained absolutely forbidden to masculine observation since their construction during the medieval period. The official narrative surrounding yogini temples has been systematically sanitized by both colonial administrators and modern Hindu reformers who prefer to characterize these spaces as repositories of symbolic art rather than active centers of esoteric spiritual practice. According to this sanitized interpretation, the elaborately carved yogini figures represent nothing more than tantric imagery designed for aesthetic contemplation, artistic allegories that express philosophical concepts about feminine divinity without serving any practical ceremonial function. This version treats the temples as historical monuments whose original religious purposes have been safely relegated to the distant past, making them suitable for academic study and tourist visitation without acknowledging their continuing role in contemporary goddess worship. However, the documented historical truth, preserved in medieval tantric manuals and regional chronicles, states with unmistakable clarity that men who entered yogini temples during active women-only ceremonies faced immediate execution, administered through both religious and civil authority. These weren't metaphorical threats or symbolic warnings, but legally sanctioned and spiritually mandated penalties designed to protect some of the most dangerous and powerful ritual practices known to Hindu tantrism. The severity of these consequences reflected sophisticated theological understanding that unauthorized masculine presence during yogini ceremonies created catastrophic spiritual imbalances requiring immediate and violent correction to prevent cosmic disaster. Shakta tradition maintains that authentic yoginis embody forms of divine power so intense and uncontrolled that they can only be safely channeled through specially prepared female practitioners who have undergone years of intensive initiation. Their exclusive rituals encompass elaborate trance dance sequences that induce possession states, controlled blood offering ceremonies that feed the goddesses, secret mantra cycles whose pronunciation can reshape reality, esoteric breathwork techniques that manipulate life force energy, and in certain lineages, carefully regulated ritualized sexuality that transforms physical pleasure into direct spiritual experience. Medieval chronicles from across central and eastern India contain numerous references to male intruders being taken by the yoginis, a euphemistic phrase that historians have identified as referring either to ritual execution carried out by the women themselves or mysterious disappearances that left no physical traces but served as effective warnings to other potential violators. The human details of these ceremonies reveal their profound integration of physical and spiritual technologies designed to create temporary incarnations of goddess consciousness within human female bodies. Participating women marked their skin with distinctive ash patterns that identified their particular goddess affiliations, while wearing collections of heavy metal anklets whose rhythmic jingling during dance movements helped induce the altered states necessary for divine possession. Their hair remained completely unbound throughout all ceremonies, symbolizing the untamed cosmic energy they channeled, while also creating dramatic visual effects that enhanced their resemblance to the fierce goddesses they temporarily embodied. This case provides one of history's clearest examples of lawful execution being systematically employed to protect exclusively female spiritual knowledge from masculine contamination or corruption. Soft lantern glow illuminates the precisely arranged tatami mats that cover the polished wooden floors of a secluded shrine chamber deep within the Heian imperial complex. Pine resin burns slowly in small, carefully positioned clay bowls, releasing aromatic smoke that carries the prayers of generations toward the invisible kami who govern both earthly and celestial affairs. The flickering light casts dancing shadows across silk screens painted with scenes of crane migrations and cherry blossoms, creating an otherworldly atmosphere where the boundary between human consciousness and divine presence becomes deliberately permeable. Shrine maidens, the sacred Miko, whose purity serves as a bridge between mortal and immortal realms, move through this consecrated space with fluid precision, their distinctive red and white garments brushing softly against the floor as they prepare for ceremonies that have remained hidden from masculine observation since the dawn of Japanese civilization. Tonight's ritual represents far more than routine shrine maintenance or public ceremonial display. This is a private purification rite, performed exclusively by women who have undergone years of intensive training in spiritual technologies that remain among the most closely guarded secrets of Shinto religious practice, knowledge so sacred and dangerous that unauthorized masculine presence has historically been punished through methods ranging from severe physical punishment to ritual execution administered according to ancient legal protocols that treat such violations as fundamental threats to cosmic order. The official narrative surrounding Miko has been systematically simplified by both imperial chroniclers and modern historians who prefer to characterize these women as decorative assistants whose primary functions involve performing communal dances and serving tea at public shrine ceremonies. According to this sanitized interpretation, Miko represented little more than attractive young women who provided aesthetic enhancement to Shinto rituals through their graceful movements and colorful costumes, functioning essentially as religious entertainers whose presence added beauty and cultural refinement to otherwise austere spiritual observances. This version treats them as peripheral figures whose contributions to Japanese religious life remain safely within traditional feminine spheres of artistic expression and domestic service. However, the documented historical truth, preserved in detailed court diaries from the Heian period and later shrine records, tells a dramatically different story about the sophisticated spiritual authority wielded by these seemingly innocent young women. These primary sources contain extensive documentation of elaborate women-only purification ceremonies involving complex water and salt rituals, sophisticated spirit invocation practices that required years of training to master safely, carefully controlled possession episodes known as kamigakari, where divine spirits temporarily inhabited human female bodies, secret chant cycles whose pronunciation could influence everything from weather patterns to political outcomes, and intricate cleansing procedures combining breathwork techniques with ritual movements designed to purify both individual consciousness and the surrounding sacred space. Men were explicitly and categorically barred from entering Miko chambers during any phase of these exclusive ceremonies, with violations punished according to severity and regional legal traditions that varied from severe beatings designed to serve as public warnings, through complete exile that effectively meant social death, to ritual expulsion from all sacred spaces, and in earlier historical periods, particularly under strict local regional law codes, immediate execution carried out according to Shinto protocols that treated such transgressions as capital crimes requiring ultimate punishment. One particularly revealing entry from a preserved Heian court diary recounts the discovery and punishment of a male courtier who had attempted to enter a Miko's private purification space during an active ceremony. The violator was immediately seized by shrine guards, held for formal judgment by religious authorities, and ultimately removed from the precincts forever, a bureaucratic phrase that scholars have identified as Shinto legal euphemism for execution. Since permanent exile from sacred spaces in medieval Japan was virtually indistinguishable from death, given the central role of shrine participation in both spiritual and economic life. The human details surrounding these exclusive ceremonies reveal their profound integration of aesthetic refinement and spiritual power that characterize the most sophisticated expressions of Japanese religious culture. During private rituals, Miko tied distinctive red silk cords around their wrists and ankles to signify their temporary ritual immunity from normal social constraints and their transformation into vessels capable of safely channeling divine energy. Their ceremonial chants followed delicate, mathematically precise rhythmic patterns, believed to create sonic frequencies that invited specific kami to enter their bodies and communicate through their voices, transforming young women into temporary oracles whose words carried the authority of divine revelation. Their hair, normally elaborately arranged according to court fashion, was deliberately worn loose and unbound during these private rites, symbolizing their openness to spiritual possession, while also creating dramatic visual effects that enhance their resemblance to the kami they temporarily embodied. The fact that even within one of history's most literate and extensively documented imperial courts, these sacred boundaries remained absolutely inviolable demonstrates the universal recognition that certain forms of female spiritual knowledge required protection through the ultimate sanction of lethal force administered through both religious and civil authority. Drums thunder with hypnotic intensity throughout a traditional Korean courtyard, their deep reverberations seeming to shake the very foundations of the hanok dwelling, while echoing off paper-covered windows and wooden beams that have witnessed countless spiritual transformations. Silk skirts and brilliant shades of crimson, emerald, and gold swirl through the enclosed space as a mudang, a female shaman whose authority derives from decades of intensive training in communicating with the spirit world, moves with fluid precision before an elaborate altar decorated with carefully arranged offerings, pristine white rice cakes, aged rice wine in porcelain vessels, fresh flowers, and ritual knives whose sharpened blades gleam with supernatural significance. The shaman breathes deeply, drawing incense-laden air into her lungs as she prepares to cross the dangerous threshold between ordinary human consciousness and the realm where ancestral spirits, household gods, and wandering ghosts maintain their influence over the living world. Suddenly, her body begins to shake with increasing intensity. First subtle tremors, then violent convulsions that signal the approach of spiritual entities seeking human vessels through which they can communicate their demands, grievances, and blessings. The room itself seems to tremble with otherworldly energy as the boundary between physical and metaphysical reality dissolves under the force of divine presence. The official narrative surrounding Korean shamanism has been systematically sanitized by both Confucian scholars and modern anthropologists who characterize these practices as inclusive folk traditions, where community members could participate freely regardless of gender, social status, or religious background. According to this interpretation, shamanic rituals represented democratic spiritual technologies accessible to anyone seeking divine guidance, with mudang functioning as neutral facilitators who helped ordinary people communicate with spirits through public ceremonies that welcomed observers and encouraged communal participation. However, the documented historical truth, preserved in detailed Joseon Dynasty legal codes and surviving court case records, reveals a dramatically different reality about the carefully regulated nature of authentic shamanic practice. These official government documents contain extensive evidence that mudang conducted numerous women-only spirit invocation ceremonies, particularly those involving dangerous possession states where divine entities temporarily inhabited human bodies. Complex healing rituals requiring intimate knowledge of medicinal and spiritual techniques, elaborate ghost appeasement procedures designed to pacify angry spirits, and sophisticated ancestral negotiation sessions where living descendants attempted to resolve conflicts with deceased family members. Male intrusion into these sacred feminine spaces was treated as a serious legal offense punishable through graduated consequences reflecting the violation's severity. Documented punishments included severe beating by local magistrates, formal arrest and interrogation, extended imprisonment designed as public deterrent, permanent exile from violated communities, elaborate ritual punishments to appease offended spirits, and in extreme cases, execution carried out according to legal protocols, treating such violations as fundamental threats to social and spiritual order. The official justification reflected sophisticated Korean theological understanding that inappropriate masculine presence during women's spirit work created catastrophic disruptions in the delicate cosmological balance governing relationships between human communities and supernatural forces. Male energy was believed to interfere with specific spiritual frequencies, enabling female shamans to achieve trance states necessary for divine possession, potentially preventing spirits from manifesting properly or causing them to withdraw protection entirely. Muzang prepared their bodies as sacred vessels by painting intricate spirals on their palms using pigments mixed with blessed water, creating protective symbols that enhanced their ability to channel supernatural energy. They wore magnificent hanbok with elaborate embroidered symbols, dragons for water deities, phoenixes for celestial powers, tigers for mountain spirits, each garment functioning as both aesthetic masterpiece and spiritual technology designed to attract appropriate divine attention. Even highly bureaucratic and institutionally Confucian Joseon Korea maintained and legally enforced these lethal boundaries, protecting women's exclusive spiritual authority, demonstrating remarkable persistence of recognition that certain forms of divine communication required specifically feminine channels to remain effective and spiritually safe. Sun-baked earth stretches across the Ethiopian highland plateau, where the ancient Beta Israel community has maintained its distinctive traditions for over a millennium, preserving religious practices that bridge ancient Israelite heritage with indigenous African spirituality. Simple woven huts cluster together in traditional village formations, their thatched roofs designed to withstand both seasonal rains and harsh highland sun. At the deliberate periphery of this settlement stands a distinctive secluded structure, the Nida House, a specialized purity dwelling that functions as far more than temporary shelter for menstruating women. Inside this sacred space, generations of Beta Israel women whisper prayers in ancient Ge'ez, while grinding blessed grain on stone implements, consecrated through centuries of ritual use. Smoke from a carefully tended fire curls upward through the rafters, carrying supplications toward ancestors who continue protecting their isolated highland community. The official narrative surrounding Beta Israel purity houses has been systematically minimized by both Ethiopian Orthodox observers and modern ethnographers who characterize these structures as simple menstrual shelters reflecting basic hygiene customs rather than acknowledging their sophisticated role as centers of exclusive female spiritual authority. According to this sanitized interpretation, Nida houses served purely practical functions designed to isolate women during periods of ritual impurity, with any religious activities confined to routine prayers that pose no challenge to masculine religious leadership within the broader community. However, detailed ethnographic investigation and preserved historical records reveal something far more spiritually significant than mere menstrual accommodation. These specialized dwellings functioned as sophisticated centers for transmitting women's ritual knowledge passed exclusively through female lineage across countless generations, encompassing elaborate purification ceremonies that went far beyond individual cleansing, complex blood-related rituals connecting women to cosmic fertility cycles, powerful protection prayers capable of shielding entire communities from supernatural threats, intensive generational instruction sessions where elder women transmitted secret knowledge to younger initiates, intricate ritual food preparation codes governing community spiritual welfare, and carefully guarded blessing ceremonies whose effectiveness depended upon absolute secrecy from masculine observation. Men were categorically forbidden from entering these purity houses under any circumstances, not through casual social taboo, but by binding communal law backed by severe penalties reflecting the serious threat that masculine intrusion posed to both individual spiritual welfare and collective community survival. The Beta Israel understood that these women's exclusive ceremonies maintained ritual purity upon which their entire community's relationship with divine protection depended, making unauthorized male presence genuinely dangerous to everyone's continued existence. Documented punishments for male transgression included immediate ostracism that effectively meant social death, complete loss of community protection, leaving violators vulnerable to spiritual and physical dangers, permanent ritual exclusion from all religious ceremonies, making normal social participation impossible, and, according to fragmentary oral histories preserved by community elders, execution carried out through traditional methods during earlier periods when the community possessed greater autonomy to enforce its own justice systems. Women conducting rituals within these sacred spaces were believed to maintain communal purity that prevented divine punishment from falling upon the entire Beta Israel settlement. Any man witnessing these exclusive ceremonies was considered to have committed violations so severe they threatened fundamental cosmic order, potentially causing protective spiritual barriers to collapse and exposing everyone to supernatural retribution. The human details reveal profound integration of practical and spiritual technologies. Women carved distinctive small lines into wooden doorposts, creating permanent lunar cycle records that enabled precise ritual timing calculations. They wore simple white cotton shawls, marking their temporary separation from ordinary social roles while symbolizing purification and readiness for divine communication. They carried specially prepared leather-bound prayer scrolls containing secret formulas written in ancient scripts, preserved unchanged through generations of female transmission, and used consecrated grinding stones believed to hold accumulated generational blessings from all previous users. This final case demonstrates remarkable persistence of patterns governing women's exclusive ritual knowledge across vast geographical and temporal distances, developing identical structural principles despite complete isolation from earlier Mediterranean civilizations. Look at these 25 cases not as isolated events, but as a map of absences, of locked doors, of ritual rooms whose floors were swept clean long before historians ever set foot near them. If you chart them chronologically, they span 5,000 years. If you plot them geographically, they form a ring around the old world and the new. If you read them as a pattern, they reveal something unsettling. The ancient world wasn't afraid of what women did. It was afraid of what women knew. That's the part the official records never say out loud. Instead, they leave us fragments, a carved warning in a Punic stele, a line of threat in a Hittite ritual tablet, a legal prohibition buried in a Roman code, a footnote in a chronicle describing a man removed for intruding. Each text gives us the punishment, but never the practice, the consequence, but not the cause, the danger, but not the knowledge that made it dangerous. And that absence isn't accidental, it's curated. Everywhere you look, women's mysteries appear in negative space, defined by the lines men were forbidden to cross, shaped by the violence waiting on the other side, preserved only by the echoes of those who broke the rules. What remains today is the perimeter, never the center, and that should trouble us more than any myth or legend. Because think about what it takes for an entire civilization. Greek, Roman, Nubian, Sabaean, Minoan, Hittite, Yoruba, Aztec, Japanese, Korean, to maintain total silence about female-only knowledge across centuries. Think about the pressure required to keep a secret not for a generation, but for hundreds of them. Think about a society so afraid of a woman's voice in a particular context that the penalty for hearing it was death. What knowledge could possibly have been that dangerous? What power could women have held that required such absolute erasure? And what does it say about our own understanding of history that we still, thousands of years later, know more about the punishment than what they were punished for? Drop a comment below. What do you think these women knew? What secrets could have been worth killing for and worth dying to keep?